61. Teasby, Secrecy and Openness, PT 11. Through green flame they whirled, through the flue network they spun, Minerva's heart racing with a pounding horror that she hadn't felt in 10 years and 3 months. The corridors between space coughed and spit them out into the lobby of Gringotts, the safest flue receiver in Diagon Alley, the connection most difficult to intercept, the fastest way out of Hogwarts without a phoenix. A goblin attendant turned toward them, his eyes widened. He began a slightly respectful bow: determination, destination, deliberation. And the two of them were in the alley just in back of Mary's place, wands already out and raised, spinning around back to back, and the words of an anti-disillusionment charm already rising to Severus's lips. The alley was empty. When she turned back to look at Severus, his wand was already cracking down on his own head with a sound like smashing an egg, as his lips chanted words of invisibility. He took on the colors of his surroundings, became a blur of his surroundings. The blur moved and matched what was behind him, and then there was nothing there. She lowered her wand and stepped forward to receive her own disillusionment. From behind her, the unmistakable sound of a burst of flame. She spun and saw Albus there, his long wand already drawn and raised in his right hand. His eyes were grim beneath the half-circles of his glasses, and Fawkes upon his shoulder had spread his fire-colored wings in readiness for flight and fight. "Albus," she said. I thought she'd just seen him depart for Azkaban, and she thought not even phoenixes could return from there so easily. Then she realized. "She escaped," said Albus. "Did your patroness reach him?" The pounding in her heart grew stronger, the horror in her veins solidified. "He said he was here, in the washroom. Let us hope he spoke true," said Albus. The wand tapped her head with a sensation like water trickling over her, and a moment later the four of them, even Fawkes, had been rendered invisible, though sometimes you saw a flicker of something like fire in his air, were racing to the front of the restaurant. They paused before the door while Albus whispered something, and a moment later one of the customers visible through the windows stood up with a vague look on his face and opened the door as though taking a quick look outside for some friend. And the three of them were through, racing past the unwitting customers. Severus was marking their faces, Minerva knew, and Albus would see any disillusioned, toward the sign that pointed to the washroom. An old wooden door marked with the sign of a toilet burst open with a slam, and four invisible rescuers stormed through it. The small but clean wooden room was empty. Fresh droplets of water showed in the sink, but there was no sign of Harry, only a sheet of paper left on the closed lid of the toilet. She couldn't breathe. The sheet of paper rose up into the air as Albus took it, and a moment later was thrust in her own direction. What did the hat tell me to tell you?" Minerva said aloud in surprise, her mind taking a moment to place the question. It wasn't the sort of thing you'd forget, but she hadn't been thinking in that mode. "Really, I'm an impudent youngster, and I should get off its lawn." "Eh," said the air in Albus's voice, as if even he could be shocked. And then Harry Potter's head appeared, suspended next to the air beside the toilet. His face was cold and alert, the too adult Harry she'd seen sometimes, eyes darting back and forth and around. "What's going on?" the boy began. Albus, now visible once more along with her and Fawkes, was moving forward in an instant. His left hand reached forward and plucked a hair from Harry's head. Producing a startled yelp from the boy, Minerva accepted the hair in her own hand, and a moment later Albus swept up the mostly invisible boy in his arms, and there was a flash of red-golden fire. And Harry Potter was safe. Minerva took a few steps forward, leaned against the wall where Albus and Harry had been, trying to recover her poise. She'd lost some habits in the 10 years since the Order of the Phoenix had disbanded. Beside her, Severus shimmered into visibility. His right hand was already drawing forth the flask from his robes, his left hand already stretching forth in demand. She gave him Harry's hair, and a moment later it dropped into the flask of unfinished polyjuice, which at once began fizzing and bubbling as it settled into the potency that would enable Severus to act his part as bait. "That was unexpected," the potions master said slowly. "Why did our headmaster not retrieve Mr. Potter earlier? I wonder if he was going so far as to twist time. There should have been nothing preventing him from doing so. Indeed, your patroness should have found Mr. Potter already safe. She hadn't thought of that, a different realization having jumped to the forefront of her mind. It wasn't nearly as horrifying as Bellatrix Black having escaped from Azkaban, but still. Harry has an invisibility cloak, she said. The potion's master did not answer. He was shrinking. Tick-snick, drip-blip, ding-ring-ting, it still annoyed her, though it faded past attention after a while. And when and if she became headmistress, she intended to silence the whole lot. Which head of Hogwarts, she wondered, had first been so inconsiderate as to create a device that made noise to pass on to their successors? She was sitting in the headmaster's office with a quickly transfigured desk of her own, doing some of the 100 little pieces of necessary paperwork that kept Hogwarts from grinding to a halt. She could lose herself in it easily, and it prevented her from thinking about other things. Albus had once remarked, sounding rather wry, that Hogwarts seemed to run even more smoothly when there was an outside crisis for her to avoid thinking about. 10 years ago, that was the last time Albus had said that. There was the chime that indicated an approaching visitor. Minerva kept reading her current parchment. The door slammed open, revealing Severus Snape, who took 3 steps inward and demanded without the slightest pause, "Any word from Mad-Eye?" Albus was already rising from his chair, even as she tucked away her parchments and dispelled the desk. "Moody's Patronus is reporting to the me in Azkaban," Albus said. His eye saw nothing, and if the eye of Vance does not see a thing, then that thing does not exist. Yourself. "No one has tried to forcibly take my blood," Severus said. He gave a quick grimace of a smile. "Except the defense professor." "What?" said Minerva. "He saw me for an impostor before I could even open my lips, and quite reasonably attacked me on the spot, demanding to know the whereabouts of Mr. Potter." Another grimace of a smile. Shouting that I was Severus Snape did not seem to reassure him for some reason. "I do believe that man would kill me for a sickle and give back 5 nuts change. I had to stun our good Professor Quirrell, which was not easy, and then he reacted poorly to the hex." Harry Potter, naturally alarmed, ran out and told the owner, and the defense professor was taken to St. Mungo's, which said he had probably been overworking himself for weeks before he collapsed. Such was his state of exhaustion. "Your precious defense professor is fine, Minerva. The stunner may have helped him by forcing him to take a few days off. Afterward, I declined the offer of a flu to Hogwarts and went back to Diagon Alley and wandered, but no one seems to have wanted Mr. Potter's blood today." "Our defense professor is in the best of hands, I am sure," said Albus. "Greater matters command our attention, Minerva." It took considerable effort for her to wrench her attention back, but she sat back down, and Severus gestured up a chair for himself as well, and the 3 of them drew together to begin their council. She felt like a polyjuiced impostor, sitting with those 2. War was not her art, nor plotting. She had to strain to keep 1 step ahead of the Weasley twins, and sometimes she failed at that. She was sitting here ultimately only because she had heard the prophecy. "We are faced," the headmaster spoke first, "with a rather alarming mystery. I can think of only 2 wizards who might have engineered this escape." Minerva drew in her breath sharply. "There is a chance it is not you-know-who." "I'm afraid so," said the headmaster. She glanced to her side and saw that Severus looked as puzzled as herself. Afraid the Dark Lord was not rising again. She would have given almost anything for that to be true. "So," Albus said heavily, "our first suspect is Voldemort, risen again and seeking to resurrect himself. I have studied many books I wish I had not read, seeking his every possible avenue of return, and I have found only 3. His strongest road to life is the Philosopher's Stone, which Flamel assures me that not even Voldemort could create on his own. By that road, he would rise greater and more terrible than ever before. I would not have thought Voldemort able to resist the temptation of the stone, still less because such an obvious trap is a challenge to his wit. But his second avenue is nearly as strong. The flesh of his servant, willingly given, the blood of his foe, forcibly taken, and the bone of his ancestor, unknowingly bequeathed. Voldemort is a perfectionist." Albus glanced at Severus, who nodded agreement, "and he would certainly seek the most powerful combination. The flesh of Bellatrix Black, the blood of Harry Potter, and the bone of his father. Voldemort's final avenue is to seduce a victim and drain the life from them over a long period, in which case Voldemort would be weak compared to his former power. His motive to spirit away Bellatrix is clear. And if he is keeping her in reserve, to use only in case he cannot attain the stone, that would explain why no kidnap attempt was made on Harry this day. Minerva glanced again at Severus, saw him listening attentively, but without surprise. What is not clear, the headmaster continued, is how Voldemort could have engineered this escape. A death doll was left in Bellatrix's place. Her escape was meant to be undetected, and even though that went wrong, the Dementors could not find her after their first warning. Azkaban has stood impenetrable for centuries, and I cannot imagine any means by which Voldemort could have accomplished this. That may mean little, Severus said, expressionless. For the Dark Lord to do what we cannot imagine requires only that he has a better imagination. Albus nodded grimly. Unfortunately, there is now another wizard who laughs at impossibilities. A wizard who, not long ago, developed a new and powerful charm which could have blinded the Dementors to Bellatrix Black's escape. And he is implicated for other reasons as well. Minerva's heart was skipping beats. She didn't know how or why, but a terrible apprehension was dawning on her as to who would that be, said Severus, sounding puzzled. Albus leaned back and said the fatal words, even as she had feared them. Harry James Potter Evansvares. Potter, demanded the potion's master, as much shock in that usually silken voice as she had ever heard from him. Headmaster, is this one of your jokes? He is in his first year at Hogwarts. A temper tantrum and a few childish pranks with an invisibility cloak does not make him. It is no joke, said Minerva, her voice barely above a whisper. Harry is already making original discoveries in transfiguration, Severus, though I did not know he was researching charms as well. Harry is no ordinary first year, the headmaster said solemnly. He is marked as the Dark Lord's equal, and he has power the Dark Lord knows not. Severus was looking at her, and you would have needed to know him well to recognize that his glance was pleading. Am I to take this seriously? Minerva simply nodded. Does anyone else know of this? New and powerful charm, Severus demanded. The headmaster glanced at her apologetically. Somehow she knew before he even said it, and she wanted to scream at the top of her lungs, and said, Quirinus Quirrell. Why, she said, in a voice that should have melted half the devices in the office. Did Mr. Potter even tell our defense professor about his brilliant new charm for breaking out of prisons? The headmaster passed a weary wrinkled hand across his equally wrinkled forehead. Quirinus just happened to be there, Minerva. Even I saw no harm in it at the time. The headmaster hesitated, and Harry said his charm was too dangerous to be explained to either of us. And when I asked him again, this day, he insisted he had still not explained it to Quirinus, nor had he ever dropped his occlumency barriers in the defense professor's presence. Mr. Potter is an occlumens. You gave him an invisibility cloak, and he is immune to Veritasrum, and he is friends with the Weasley twins. Albus, do you have any idea what you have unleashed upon this school? Her voice was nearly shrieking now. By his 7th year there won't be anything left of Hogwarts but a smoking hole in the ground. Albus leaned back in his great cushioned chair and said, smiling, Don't forget the time-turner. She did scream then, but quietly. Severus drawled, Should I teach him to brew polyjuice, headmaster? I ask only for the sake of completeness, in case you are not satisfied with the magnitude of your pet disaster. Perhaps next year, said Albus. My dearest friends, the question before us is whether Harry Potter has spirited Bellatrix Black out of Azkaban, which is more than youthful high spirits, even by my tolerant standards. Excuse me, headmaster, Severus said, with one of the drier smiles she had ever seen him deliver to Albus. But I will register my opinion that the answer is no. This is the Dark Lord's work, pure and simple. Then why, Albus said, and now there was no humor at all in his voice. When I planned to retrieve Harry immediately after his arrival in Diagon Alley, did I find that this would result in paradox? Minerva sank further back into her chair, dropped her left elbow onto the hard, uncushioned armrest, leaned her head into her hand, and shut her eyes in despair. There was a narrowly circulated proverb to the effect that only 1 Auror in 30 was qualified to investigate cases involving time-turners, and that of those few, the half who weren't already insane, soon would be. So you suspect, Severus's voice was saying, that Potter went from Diagon Alley to Azkaban, then looped back to Diagon Alley afterward to be picked up by us. Precisely, said Albus's voice. Though it is also possible that Voldemort or his servants watched to make sure Harry did arrive in Diagon Alley before they began their attempt on Azkaban, and that they had someone with a time-turner who would send back the message of their success to trigger the abduction. Indeed, it was my suspicion of this possibility that caused me to dispatch you and Minerva on your own mission before I myself went to Azkaban. I thought then that their breakout would fail, but if retrieving Harry Potter meant observing the fact of their eventual failure, then I myself could not have gone to Azkaban after I had interacted with him, for Azkaban's future cannot touch its past. When in Azkaban, I received no report from you or Minerva, nor from Flitwick, whom I told to try contacting you. I knew that your interaction with Harry Potter had been an interaction with Azkaban's future, meaning that someone was sending messages through time. Then Albus's voice stopped. But Headmaster, said Severus, you came back from Azkaban's future and interacted with us. The potions master's voice trailed off. But Severus, if I had received reports from you and Minerva of Harry's safety, I would not in the first place have gone backward in time to Headmaster. I think we must draw diagrams for this. I agree, Severus. There was the sound of parchment being spread on a table, and then quills scratching, and more arguing. Minerva sat in her chair, head resting in her hand, eyes shut. There was a story she'd once heard about a criminal who had possessed a time-turner, which the Department of Mysteries had sealed to him, in a case of extremely bad judgment as to who needed one. And there had been an aura assigned to track down this unknown time criminal, who had also been given a time-turner. And the story ended with both of them in St. Mungo's ward for total unrecoverable nutcases. Minerva sat there with her eyes shut, trying not to listen, trying not to think about it, and trying not to go insane. After a while, when the argument seemed to have wound down, she said aloud, Mr. Potter's time-turner is restricted to the hours of 9 p.m. through midnight. Was the shell tampered with, Albus? Not to my most discerning charms, said Albus, but the shells are new things, and to defeat the unspeakable's precautions and leave no trace of the defeat might not be impossible. She opened her eyes and saw Severus and the headmaster staring intently at a parchment covered with tangled squiggles that would have no doubt driven her mad to comprehend. Have you come to any conclusions? Minerva said, and please don't tell me how you arrived at them. Severus and the headmaster looked at each other, then turned to look at her. We have concluded, the headmaster said gravely, that either Harry was involved or he was not, that either Voldemort has access to a time-turner or he does not, and that regardless of what could have happened within Azkaban, nobody would have visited the little Hangleton graveyard during the period Moody has already watched over it within my own past. In short, Severus drawled, we know nothing, dear Minerva, though it seems at least likely that another time-turner was involved somehow. My own suspicion is that Potter has been bribed, tricked, or threatened into conveying messages backward in time, perhaps even regarding this very prison break. I shall not make the obvious suggestion as to who is pulling his strings, but I suggest that at 9:00 tonight, we test whether Potter is able to travel the full 6 hours backward to 3:00 to see if he has yet used his time-turner. That seems wise to do in any case, said Dumbledore. See that done, Minerva, and tell Harry to stop in my office at his convenience afterward. But you still suspect Harry of direct involvement in the prison break itself, Minerva said. Possible, but unlikely, said Severus. At the same time, Albus said, yes. Minerva pinched the bridge of her nose, took a deep breath, let it out. Albus, Severus, what possible reason has Mr. Potter to do such a thing? None that I can think of, said Albus. But it remains that Harry's magics alone, of all the means known to me, might have. Hold, said Severus. All expression vanished from his face. A thought occurs to me. I must check. The potions master seized a pinch of flue powder, strode across the room toward the fireplace. Albus hastily waved his wand to light it, and then in a flare of green flame, and the words Slytherin head of house office, Severus was gone. She and Albus looked at each other, and both shrugged, and then Albus turned back to studying the parchment. It was only a few minutes later that Severus spun back out of the flue, brushing traces of ash from himself. Well, said the potions master, again the expressionless face, I am afraid that Mr. Potter does have a motive. Speak, said Albus. I found Lesseth Lestrange in the slithering common room studying, Severus said. He was not reluctant to meet my eyes. It seems that Mr. Lestrange did not like to think of his parents in Azkaban, in the cold and the darkness, with the Dementors sucking away their life, hurting every second of every day, and he told Mr. Potter so in as many words and begged him to get them out. Since, you see, Mr. Lestrange had heard that the boy who lived could do anything. She and Albus exchanged glances. Severus, Minerva said, surely. Even Harry has more common sense than that. Her voice trailed off. Mr. Potter thinks he is God, Severus said without expression, and Lesseth Lestrange fell to his knees before him in a heartfelt cry of prayer. Minerva stared at Severus, feeling sick to her stomach. She had studied Muggle religion. It was the most common reason for needing to memory charm the parents of Muggle-borns, and she knew enough to understand what Severus had just said. In any case, said the potions master, I looked within Mr. Lestrange to see if he knew anything of his mother's escape. He has heard nothing, but the instant he learns, he will conclude that the person responsible was Harry Potter. I see, Albus said slowly. Thank you, Severus. That is good news. Good news, Minerva burst out. Albus looked at her, his face as expressionless as Severus's now, and she remembered with a shock that Albus's own. It is the best reason I can possibly imagine for removing Bellatrix from Azkaban, Albus said quietly. And if it is not Harry, let us recall, then it is certainly Voldemort himself making his first moves. But let us not be hasty in judgment while there is much we do not yet know, but soon will. Albus once more stood up from behind his desk, strode to the fireplace still alight, cast in another pinch of green powder, and stuck his head into the flames. Department of Magical Law Enforcement, he said. Director's office. After a moment, the voice of Madame Bones came through clear and sharp. What is it, Albus? I am somewhat busy. Amelia, said Albus, I beg of you to share any discoveries you have made concerning this matter. There was a pause. Oh, said the cold voice of Madame Bones from the blazing fire, and is that a two-way road then, Albus? It may be, the old wizard said calmly. If any Auror dies of your reticence, old meddler, I will hold you responsible in full measure. I understand, Amelia, Albus said, but I have no wish to spark needless alarm and incredulity. Bellatrix Black has escaped from Azkaban. What alarm or incredulity do you think I will call needless in the face of that? I may call on you to remember those words, said the old wizard into the green flames. For if I learn that my fears are not needless, I will tell you. Now, Amelia, I beg you, if you have learned anything whatsoever upon this matter, please share it. There was another pause, and then Madame Bones's voice said, I have information which I learned 4 hours into the future, Albus. Do you still want it? Albus paused, weighing, Minerva knew, the possibility that he might want to go back more than 2 hours from this instant. For you couldn't send information further back in time than 6 hours, not through any chain of time turners. And finally said, Yes, please. We had a lucky break, said Madame Bones's voice. One of the Aurors who witnessed the escape was a Muggle-born, and she told us that the flying fire spell, as we were calling it, might be no spell at all, but a Muggle artifact. Like a punch in the stomach, that was how it felt, and the sickness in Minerva's belly redoubled. Anyone who'd watched a Chaos Legion battle knew whose hand that showed. Madame Bones's voice continued. We brought in Arthur Weasley from misuse of Muggle artifacts. He knows more about Muggle artifacts than any wizard alive, and gave him the descriptions from the Aurors on the scene, and he cracked it. It was a Muggle artifact called a rocker, and they call it that because you'd have to be off your rocker to ride one. Just 6 years ago, one of their rockers blew up, killed hundreds of Muggles in a flash, and almost set fire to the moon. Weasley says that rockers use a special kind of science called opposite reaction, so the plan is to develop a jinx which will prevent that science from working around Azkaban. Thank you, Amelia, Albus said gravely. Is that everything? I'll check if we have anything from 6 hours forward, said the voice of Madame Bones. If so, they wouldn't have told me, but I'll have them tell you. Do you have anything you want to tell me, Albus? Which of those two possibilities is it looking like? Not yet, Amelia, Albus said, but I may have word for you soon. He straightened up from the fire then, which faded back to ordinary yellow flames. Every minute of the old wizard's years, every natural second since his birth, and every second which time-turning had added, all of that plus a few extra decades for stress, was visible on his lined face. "Severus," the old wizard said. "What was it actually?" "A rocket," said the half-blood potions master, who had grown up in the Muggle town of Spinner's End. "One of the most impressive Muggle technologies." "How likely is Harry to know such arts?" said Minerva. Severus drawled, "Oh, a boy like Mr. Potter knows all about rockets. That, dear Minerva, is a certainty. You must remember that things are done differently in the Muggle world." Severus frowned. "But rockets are dangerous and expensive." "Harry has stolen and hidden an unknown amount of money from his Gringotts vault, perhaps thousands of galleons," said the headmaster, and then, to their twin stares, "That was not in my plan, but I made the mistake of sending the defense professor to supervise Harry's withdrawal of 5 galleons for Christmas presents." The headmaster shrugged. "Yes, I agree. Sheer folly in retrospect. Let us continue." Minerva quietly thudded her head a few times against the headrest of her chair. "Nonetheless, headmaster," Severus said, "just because the Death Eaters never used Muggle artifacts in the First War, that does not mean he is ignorant. Rockets fell on Britain as weapons in the Muggle side of Grindelwald's war. If he spent the summers of those years in a Muggle orphanage, as you told us, headmaster, then he, too, has heard of rockets. And if he has been listening to reports of Mr. Potter and his mock battles using Muggle artifacts, he would certainly learn his enemy's strengths and try to redouble them himself. That is just how he thinks. Any power he sees he will try to take for his own." The old wizard was standing stark still, utterly motionless, even the hairs of his beard frozen in place like solid wires. And the thought came to Minerva, as frightening as any thought she'd ever had, that Albus Dumbledore was rooted to the spot in horror. "Severus," Albus Dumbledore said, and his voice almost cracked, "do you realize what you are saying? If Harry Potter and Voldemort fight their war with Muggle weapons, there will be nothing left of the world but fire." "What?" said Minerva. She had heard of guns, of course, but they weren't that dangerous to an experienced witch. Severus spoke, as though she weren't in the room. "Then perhaps, headmaster, he's sending a deliberate warning to Harry Potter of exactly that, saying that any attack with Muggle weapons will be met with retaliation in kind. Command Mr. Potter to cease his use of Muggle technology in his battles. That will show him the message is received, and not give him any more ideas." Severus frowned. "Though come to think of it, Mr. Malfoy, and of course Miss Granger, well, on second thought a blanket prohibition on technology seems wiser." The old wizard pressed both his hands to his forehead, and from his lips came an unsteady voice. "I begin to hope that it is Harry behind this escape. Oh, Merlin, defend us all. What have I done? What have I done? What will become of the world?" Severus shrugged. "From the rumors I have heard, headmaster, Muggle weapons are only slightly worse than the more recondite aspects of wizardry." "Worse," gasped Minerva, and then shut her mouth as though by force. "Worse than any peril left in these fading years," said Albus. "Not worse than that which erased Atlantis from time." Minerva stared at him, feeling the sweat break out all along her spine. Severus continued, still addressing Albus. "All the Death Eaters save Bellatrix would have betrayed him. All his supporters turned against him. All the powers of the world converged to destroy him if he had been reckless with any truly dangerous potency. Is this so different then?" Some motion, some color had returned to the old wizard's face. "Perhaps not. And in any case," Severus said with a slightly condescending smile, "Muggle weapons are not so easy to obtain. Not for 1,000 galleons or 1,000,000. Doesn't Harry just transfigure the devices he uses in his battles?" thought Minerva, but before she could open her mouth to ask, the fireplace erupted in green flames then, and the face of Pew's Thickness, Madam Bones's assistant, appeared therein. "Chief Warlock," said Thickness, "I have a report for you." Transmitted from Thickness's eyes flickered over Minerva and Severus. 6 minutes ago." 6 hours ahead, you mean," said Albus. "These two are meant to hear it. Deliver your report." "We know how it was done," said Thickness. "In Bellatrix's black cell, hidden in one corner, was a potions vial, and testing the traces of remaining fluid shows that it was an animagus potion." There was a long pause. "I see," Albus said heavily. "Pardon me," said Minerva. She didn't. Thickness's head turned toward her. Animagi, Madame McGonagall in their animagus forms are of less interest to Dementors. All prisoners are tested before their arrival at Azkaban, and if they are animagi, their animagus form is destroyed. But we had not considered that someone protected by a patronus charm while taking the potion and performing the meditation might be able to become an animagus after they went to Azkaban. I understood, Severus said, having by now put on his customary sneer, that the animagus meditation required considerable time. Well, Mr. Snape, Thickness barked, records show that Bellatrix Black was an animagus before she was sentenced to Azkaban and her form destroyed, so maybe her second meditation didn't take as much time as her first. I would not have thought it possible for any prisoner of Azkaban to do such a thing, Albus said, but Bellatrix Black was a most powerful sorceress before her incarceration, and she might have done it if any witch could. Can Azkaban be secured against this method? Yes, said the confident head of Pew's Thickness. Our expert says that it is nigh unimaginable that an animagus meditation could be performed in less than 3 hours, regardless of experience. All visits to prisoners allowed to receive them will be limited to 2 hours henceforth, and the Dementors will inform us if any patronus charm is maintained in the prison areas for longer than that. Albus looked unhappy at that, but nodded. I see. There will be no further attempts of that sort, of course, but do not relax your vigilance. And when Amelia has been told all this, tell her that I have information for her. The head of Pew's Thickness vanished without another word. No further attempts, said Minerva. Because, dear Minerva, Severus drawled, having not quite taken off his habitual sneer, if the Dark Lord had planned to free any of his other servants from Azkaban, he would not have left behind the vial of potion to tell us how it was done. Severus frowned. I confess, even so I do not see why that vial was left there. It is some kind of message, Albus said slowly, and I cannot see what it means, not at all. He drummed his fingers on his desk. For a long minute or three, the old wizard stared off into nothingness, frowning, while Severus also sat in silence. Then Albus shook his head in dismay and said, Severus, do you comprehend this? No, said the potion's master, and with a sardonic smile, which is probably all the better for us. Whatever we are intended to conclude from it, that part of his plan has misfired. You are certain now that it is, you know, that it is Voldemort, said Minerva. It could not be that some other Death Eater conceived this clever notion. And they knew about rockets, too, Severus said dryly. I don't believe the other Death Eaters were so fond of Muggle studies. It is he. Aye, it is he, Albus said. Azkaban has endured impenetrable for ages, only to fall to an ordinary animagus potion. It is too clever and too impossible, which was ever Voldemort's signature since the days he was known as Tom Riddle. Anyone who wished to forge that signature must needs be as cunning as Voldemort himself to do so, and there is no one else in the world who would accidentally overestimate my wit and leave me a message I cannot understand at all. Unless he has gauged you exactly, Severus said tonelessly, in which case all that is just what he intended you to think. Albus sighed. Indeed, but even if he has tricked me perfectly, we may at least rely on the conclusion that it was not Harry Potter. It should have come as a relief, and yet Minerva felt the chill spreading through her spine and her veins, her lungs and her bones. She remembered conversations like this. She remembered conversations like this from 10 years ago, from a time when blood had run through Britain in wide rivers, when wizards and witches she had once taught in class had been slaughtered by the hundreds. She remembered burning homes and screaming children and flashes of green light. What will you tell Madam Bones? She whispered. Albus stood from his desk and paced to the center of the room, his hand lightly touching the devices. Here an instrument of light, there an instrument of sound. He adjusted his glasses with one hand, used the other to center the long silver beard against his robes, and then finally that ancient wizard turned back and faced them. I will tell her what little I know of the dark art called Horcrux, by which a soul is deprived of death, said Albus Dumbledore, in a soft voice that seemed to fill the whole room, and I will tell her what may be done with the flesh of the servant. I will tell her that I am reconstituting the Order of the Phoenix. I will tell her that Voldemort has returned, and that the second Wizarding War is begun. Some hours later. The antique old clock upon the wall of the deputy headmistress's office had golden hands and silver numerals to make the clock face. It ticked and jerked soundlessly through its motions, for there was a quieting enchantment on it. The golden hour hand approached the silver numeral of 9. The golden minute hand did the same, the two linked components of time nearing each other, soon to be in the same place and never to collide. It was 8:43 p.m., and the time approached when Harry's time turner would open, to be tested in the one way that no imaginable spell could fool, unless that spell could bypass the laws of time itself. No body or soul, no knowledge or substance, could stretch an extra 7 hours in a single day. She would make up a message on the spot, and tell Harry to take that message back 6 hours to Professor Flitwick at 3 p.m., and she would ask Professor Flitwick if he had received it in that hour. And Professor Flitwick would tell her that he had indeed received it at 3 p.m., and she would tell Severus and Albus to have a little more faith in Harry next time. Professor McGonagall cast the Patronus charm and told her shining cat, "Go to Mr. Potter and tell him this. Mr. Potter, please come to my office as soon as you hear this, without doing anything else along the way." 62. The Stamford Prison Experiment, Final. Minerva gazed up at the clock, the golden hands and silver numerals, the jerking motion. Muggles had invented that, and until they had, wizards had not bothered keeping time. Bells, timed by a sanded hourglass, had served Hogwarts for its classes when it was built. It was one of the things that blood purists wished not to be true, and therefore Minerva knew it. She had received an outstanding on her Muggle studies, NEWT, which now seemed to her a mark of shame, considering how little she knew. Her younger self had realized, even then, that the class was a sham, taught by a pureblood, supposedly because Muggle-borns could not appreciate what wizard-borns needed to be told, and actually because the Board of Governors did not approve of Muggles at all. But when she was 17, the outstanding grade had been the main thing that mattered to her. She was saddened to remember. If Harry Potter and Voldemort fight their war with Muggle weapons, there will be nothing left of the world but fire. She couldn't imagine it, and the reason she couldn't imagine it was that she couldn't imagine Harry fighting you-know-who. She had encountered the Dark Lord 4 times, and survived each one, 3 times with Albus to shield her, and once with Moody at her side. She remembered the damaged, snake-like face, the faint green scales scattered over the skin, the glowing red eyes, the voice that laughed in a high-pitched hiss and promised nothing but cruelty and torment, the monster pure and complete. And Harry Potter was easy to picture in her mind, the bright expression on the face of a young boy who wavered between taking the ludicrous seriously and taking the serious ludicrously. And to think of the two of them facing off at one point was too painful to be imagined. They had no right at all to set this on an 11-year-old boy. She knew what the headmaster had decided for him this day, for she had been told to make the arrangements. And if it had been her at the same age, she would have raged and screamed and cried and been inconsolable for weeks. And he is no ordinary first year, Albus had said. He is marked as the Dark Lord's equal, and he has power the Dark Lord knows not. The terrible hollow voice booming from Sybil Trelawney's throat, the true and original prophecy, echoed once more through her mind. She had a feeling it didn't mean what the headmaster thought it did, but there was no way to put the difference into words. And even so it still seemed true that if there were any 11-year-old within the earth entire who could bear this burden, that boy approached her office now. And if she said anything at all like, "Poor Harry," to his face, well, he wouldn't like it. "So now I've got to find some way to kill an immortal dark wizard," Harry had said on the day he had first learned. "I really wish you had told me that before I started shopping." She'd been head of House Gryffindor for long enough. She'd watched enough friends die to know that there were some people you couldn't save from becoming heroes. There came a knock at the door, and Professor McGonagall said, "Enter." When Harry entered, his face had the same cold, alert look she'd seen in Mary's place, and she wondered for an instant if he'd been wearing that same mask, that same self, this whole day. The young boy seated himself on the chair before her desk and said, "So is it time for me to be told what's going on?" Neutral, the words, not the sharpness that should have gone with the expression. Professor McGonagall's eyes rose in surprise before she could stop them, and she said, "The headmaster told you nothing, Mr. Potter." The boy shook his head. "Only that he'd received a warning that I might be in danger, but I was safe now." Minerva was having trouble meeting his gaze. How could they do this to him? How could they lay this upon an 11-year-old boy, this war, this destiny, this prophecy? And they didn't even trust him. She forced herself to look at Harry directly and saw that his green eyes were calm as they rested on her. "Professor McGonagall," the boy said quietly. "Mr. Potter," said Professor McGonagall, "I'm afraid it is not my place to explain, but if after this the headmaster still does not tell you anything, you may come back to me, and I will go yell at him for you." The boy's eyes widened, something of the real Harry showing through the crack before the cool mask was set back in place. "In any case," Professor McGonagall said briskly, "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Potter, but I need to ask you to use your time turner to go back 6 hours to 3 o'clock and give the following message to Professor Flitwick, Silver on the Tree. Ask the professor to note down the time at which you gave him that message. Afterward, the headmaster wishes to meet with you at your convenience." There was a pause. Then the boy said, "I am suspected of misusing my time turner then." "Not by me," Professor McGonagall said hastily. "I am sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Potter." There was another pause, and then the young boy shrugged. "It'll play hob with my sleep schedule, but I suppose it can't be helped. Please let the house elves know that if I ask for an early breakfast at, say, 3 a.m. tomorrow morning, I'm to receive it." "Of course, Mr. Potter," she said. "Thank you for understanding." The boy rose up from his chair and gave her a formal nod, then slipped out the door with his hand, already going under his shirt to where his time-turner waited, and she almost called out Harry. Only she wouldn't have known what to say after. Instead, she waited, her eyes on the clock. How long did she need to wait for Harry Potter to go back in time? She didn't need to wait at all, actually. If he had done it, then it had already happened. Minerva knew, then, that she was delaying because she was nervous, and the realization saddened her. Mischief, yes, unspeakable, unthinkable mischief, with all the prudence and foresight of a falling rock. She didn't know how the boy had tricked the hat into not sorting him to Gryffindor, where he obviously belonged, but nothing dark or harmful, not ever. Beneath that mischief his goodness ran as deep and as true as the Weasley twins, though not even the Cruciatus curse could have got her to say that out loud. "Expecto Patronum," she said, and then, "Go to Professor Flitwick and bear back his reply after you ask him this. Did Mr. Potter give you a message from me? What was that message, and when did you receive it?" 1 hour earlier, having used the last remaining spin of his time-turner after putting on the cloak of invisibility, Harry tucked the hourglass back into his shirt, and he set out toward the Slytherin dungeons, striding as quickly as his invisible legs could manage, though not running. Thankfully, the deputy headmistress's office was already on a lower floor of Hogwarts. A few staircases later, taken 2 steps, but not 3 steps at once, Harry stopped at a corridor around whose final bend lay the entrance to the Slytherin dorms. Harry took a piece of parchment, not paper, out of his pouch, took a quotes quill, not pen, out of his pouch, and told the quill, "Write these letters exactly as I say them. ZPGBSY, space, FVYREBGURGRR. There were 2 kinds of codes in cryptography. Codes that stopped your little brother from reading your message, and codes that stopped major governments from reading your message. And this was the first kind of code, but it was better than nothing. In theory, no one should read it anyway, but even if they did, they wouldn't remember anything interesting unless they did cryptography first." Harry then put that parchment in a parchment envelope, and with his wand melted a little green wax to seal it. In principle, of course, Harry could have done all that hours earlier, but somehow waiting until after he heard the message from Professor McGonagall's own lips seemed less like messing with time. Harry then put that envelope inside another envelope, which already contained another sheet of paper with other instructions and 5 silver sickles. He closed that envelope, which already had a name written on the outside, sealed it with more green wax, and pressed a final sickle into that seal. Then Harry put that envelope into the very last envelope, on which was written in large letters the name, Mary Tavington. And Harry peeked around the bend to where the scowling portrait that served as the door to the Slytherin dorms waited. And as he did not wish the portrait to recall not seeing anyone invisible, Harry used the hover charm to float the envelope to the scowling man and tap it against him. The scowling man looked down at the envelope, peering at it through a monocle, and sighed, and turned around to face toward the inside of the Slytherin dorms, and called, "Message for Mary Tavington." The envelope was then allowed to fall to the floor. A few moments later, the portrait door opened, and Mary snatched up the envelope from the floor. She would open it up and find a sickle and an envelope addressed to a fourth-year student named Margaret Bulstrode. Slytherins did this sort of thing all the time, and a sickle definitely constituted a rush order. Margaret would open her envelope and find 5 sickles along with an envelope to be dropped off in an unused classroom. After she used her time turner to go back 5 hours, whereupon she would find another 5 sickles waiting for her if she got there quickly, and an invisible Harry Potter would be waiting in that classroom from 3 p.m. to 3:30, just in case someone tried the obvious test. Well, it had been obvious to Professor Quirrell anyway. It had also been obvious to Professor Quirrell that A. Margaret Bulstrode had a time turner, and B. she wasn't very strict about how she used it, e.g. telling her younger sister really good pieces of gossip before anyone else had heard. Some of the tension leaked off Harry as he strode away from the portrait door, still invisible. Somehow his mind had still managed to worry about the plan, even knowing that it had already succeeded. Now there remained only the confrontation with Dumbledore, and then he was done for the day. He'd go to the headmaster's gargoyles at 9 p.m., since doing it at 8 p.m. would seem more suspicious. This way he could claim that he'd just misunderstood what Professor McGonagall had meant by afterward. The obscure pain clutched at Harry's heart again as he thought of Professor McGonagall. So Harry retreated a little further into his dark side, which had worn the calm expression and kept the fatigue off his face, and kept walking. There would come a reckoning, but sometimes you had to borrow everything you could today and let the payments come due tomorrow. Even Harry's dark side was feeling the exhaustion by the time the spiraling staircase had delivered him to the great oaken door that was the final gate to Dumbledore's office. But since Harry was now legally 4 hours past his natural bedtime, it was safe to let some of the fatigue show, the physical if not the emotional. The oaken door swung open. Harry's eyes had already been focused in the direction of the great desk, the throne behind it. So it took a moment to register that the throne was empty, the desk barren, but for a single leather-bound volume. And then Harry shifted his gaze to see the wizard standing among his fiddly things, the mysterious unknown devices in their scores. Fawkes and the Sorting Hat occupied their respective perches. A bright, cheerful blaze crackled in a nook that Harry had not before realized was a fireplace, and there were the 2 umbrellas and 3 red slippers for left feet. All things in their place, and in their customary appearance, except the old wizard himself, standing tall and dressed in robes of the most formal black. It came as a shock to the eyes. Those robes on that person, it was as if Harry had seen his father wearing a business suit. Very ancient was the appearance of Albus Dumbledore, and sorrowful. "Hello, Harry," said the old wizard. From within an alternate self maintained like an occlumency construct, an innocent Harry who had absolutely no idea what was happening inclined his head coldly and said, "Headmaster, I expect you've heard back from Deputy Headmistress McGonagall by now, so if it's fine by you, I would really like to know what is going on." "Yes," said the old wizard. "It is time, Harry Potter." The back straightened, only slightly, for the wizard had already been standing straight. But somehow even that small change made the wizard seem a foot taller and stronger, if not younger, formidable though not dangerous. His potency gathered about him like a cowl. In a clear voice then he spoke. "This day your war against Voldemort has begun." "What?" said the outer Harry, who knew nothing, while something watching from inside thought much the same, only with a lot more profanity attached. "Bellatrix Black has been taken from Azkaban. She has escaped from a prison inescapable," the old wizard said. "It is a feat that bears Voldemort's signature if ever I have seen it. And she, his most faithful servant, is one of 3 requisites he must obtain to rise again in a new body. After 10 years, the enemy you once defeated has returned, as was foretold." Neither part of Harry could think of anything to say to that, at least not for the few seconds before the old wizard continued. "It need change little for you for now," said the old wizard. "I have begun reconstituting the Order of the Phoenix that will serve you. I have alerted the few souls who can and should understand. Amelia Bones, Alastair Moody, Bartemius Crouch, certain others. Of the prophecy, yes, there is a prophecy, I have not told them. But they know that Voldemort is returned, and they know that you are to play some vital role. They and I shall fight your war in its lesser beginnings, while you grow stronger and perhaps wiser here at Hogwarts." The old wizard's hand came up, as though beseeching. "So to you, for now, there is but one change, and I implore you to understand its necessity. Do you recognize the book on my desk, Harry?" The inner part of Harry was screaming and banging its head against imaginary walls, while the outer Harry turned and stared at what proved to be there was a rather long pause. Then Harry said, "It is a copy of The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien." "You recognized a quote from that book," said Dumbledore, an intent look in his eyes. "So I assume you remember it well. If I am mistaken, let me be corrected." Harry just stared at him. "It is important to understand," said Dumbledore, "that this book is not a realistic depiction of a wizarding war. John Tolkien never fought Voldemort. Your war will not be like the books you have read. Real life is not like stories. Do you understand, Harry?" Harry rather slowly nodded yes, and then shook his head no. "In particular," said Dumbledore, "there is a certain very foolish thing that Gandalf does in the first book. He makes many mistakes, does Tolkien's wizard, but this one error is the most unforgivable. That mistake is this. When Gandalf first suspected, even for a moment, that Frodo held the One Ring, he should have moved Frodo to Rivendell at once. He might have been embarrassed, that old wizard, if his suspicions had proven false. He might have found it awkward to so command Frodo, and Frodo would have been greatly inconvenienced, needing to set aside many other plans and pastimes. But a little embarrassment, and awkwardness, and inconvenience is as nothing compared to the loss of your whole war, when the 9 Nazgul swoop down on the Shire while you are reading old scrolls in Minas Tirith, and take the ring at once. And it is not Frodo alone who would have been hurt. All Middle-earth would have fallen into slavery. If it had not been only a story, Harry, they would have lost their war. Do you understand what I am saying?" Said Harry, "not exactly." There was something about Dumbledore when he was like this, which made it hard to stay properly cold. His dark side had trouble with weird. "Then I will spell it out," said the old wizard. His voice was stern, his eyes were sad. "Frodo should have been moved to Rivendell at once by Gandalf himself, and Frodo should never have left Rivendell without guard. There should have been no night of terror in Bree, no Barrowdowns, no Weathertop where Frodo was wounded. They could have lost their entire war any of those times, for Gandalf's folly. Do you understand now what I am saying to you, son of Michael and Petunia?" And the Harry who knew nothing did understand. And the Harry who knew nothing saw that it was the smart, the wise, the intelligent and sane, the right thing to do. And the Harry who knew nothing said just what an innocent Harry would have said, while the silent watcher screamed in confusion and agony. "You're saying," Harry said, his voice shaking as the emotions inside burned through the outer calm, "that I'm not going home to my parents for Easter." "You will see them again," the old wizard said swiftly. "I will beg them to come here to be with you. I will extend them every courtesy during their visits. But you are not going home for Easter, Harry. You are not going home for the summer. You are no longer taking lunches in Diagon Alley, even with Professor Quirrell to watch you. Your blood is the second requisite Voldemort needs to rise as strong as before. So you are never again leaving the bounds of Hogwarts's wards without a vital reason and a guard strong enough to fend off any attack for long enough to get you to safety." Water was beginning at the corners of Harry's eyes. "Is that a request?" said his quavering voice. "Or an order?" "I'm sorry, Harry," the old wizard said softly. "Your parents will see the necessity, I hope, but if not, I am afraid they have no recourse. The law, however wrongly, does not recognize them as your guardians." "I am sorry, Harry, and I will understand if you despise me for it, but it must be done." Harry whirled, looked at the door. He couldn't look at Dumbledore anymore, couldn't trust his own face. "This is the cost to yourself," said Hufflepuff within his mind, "even as you imposed costs on others. Will that change your whole view of the matter, the way Professor Quirrell thinks it will?" Automatically, the mask of the innocent Harry said exactly what it would have said. "Are my parents in danger? Do they need to be moved here?" "No," said the old wizard's voice. "I do not think so. The Death Eaters learned, toward the end of the war, not to attack the Order's families. And if Voldemort is now acting without his former companions, he still knows that it is I who make the decisions for now, and he knows that I would give him nothing for any threat to your family. I have taught him that I do not give in to blackmail, and so he will not try." Harry turned back then and saw a coldness on the old wizard's face to match the shift in his voice. Dumbledore's blue eyes grown hard as steel behind the glasses. It didn't match the person, but it matched the formal black robes. "Is that everything, then?" said Harry's trembling voice. Later he would think about this. Later he would think of some cunning countermeasure. Later he would ask Professor Quirrell if there was any way to convince the headmaster he was mistaken. Right now, maintaining the mask was taking all of Harry's attention. "Voldemort used a Muggle artifact to escape Azkaban," the old wizard said. "He is watching you and learning from you, Harry Potter. Soon, a man named Arthur Weasley at the Ministry will issue an edict that all use of Muggle artifacts must cease in the defense professor's battles. In the future, when you have a good idea, keep it closer about yourself." It didn't seem important by comparison. Harry just nodded and said again, "Is that everything?" There was a pause. "Please," said the old wizard in a whisper. "I have no right to ask your forgiveness, Harry James Potter Ravensvers, but please at least say that you understand why." There was water in the old wizard's eyes. "I understand," said the voice of the outer Harry who did understand. "I mean, I was sort of thinking about it anyway. Wondering whether I could get you and my parents to let me stay over at Hogwarts during the summer like the orphans, so I could read the library here. It's just more interesting at Hogwarts anyway." A choking sound came from Albus Dumbledore's throat. Harry turned again toward the door. It wasn't escape unscathed, but it was escape. He took a step forward. His hand reached to the door handle. A piercing cry split the air, as though in slow motion, as Harry spun. He saw the phoenix already launched through the air and winging toward him. From the true Harry, the one who knew his own guilt, came a flash of panic. He hadn't thought of that, hadn't anticipated it. He'd prepared to face Dumbledore, but he'd forgotten about Fawkes' flap, flap, and flap. 3 times the phoenix's wings flapped like the flaring up and dying down of a fire. Duration seemed to pass too slowly as Fawkes soared over the mysterious devices toward where Harry stood. And the red golden bird was hovering in front of him with gentle wing sweeps, bobbing in the air like a candle flame. "What is it, Fawkes?" said the false Harry in puzzlement, looking the phoenix in the eyes, as he would if he were innocent. The real Harry, feeling the same awful sickness inside as when Professor McGonagall had expressed her trust in him, thought, "Did I turn evil today, Fawkes? I didn't think I was evil. Do you hate me now? If I've become something a phoenix hates, maybe I should just give it up now. Give up everything now and confess." Fawkes screamed, the most terrible cry Harry had ever heard. A scream that set all the devices vibrating and made all the sleeping figures start within their portraits. It pierced through all of Harry's defenses like a white-hot sword through butter, collapsed all his layers like a punctured balloon popping, reshuffled his priorities in an instant as he remembered the one most important thing. The tears began pouring freely from Harry's eyes down his cheeks. His voice choked as the words came out of his throat like coughing up lava. "Fawkes says," Harry's voice said. "He wants me to do something about the prisoners in Azkaban." "Fawkes, no," said the old wizard. Dumbledore strode forward, reaching out to the phoenix with a pleading hand. The old wizard's voice was almost as desperate as the phoenix's scream had been. "You cannot ask that of him, Fawkes. He's only a boy still." "You went to Azkaban," Harry whispered. "You took Fawkes with you. He saw, you were there, you saw. Why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you let them out?" When the instrument stopped vibrating, Harry realized that Fawkes had screamed at the same time as his own scream, that the phoenix was now flying next to Harry and facing Dumbledore at his side, the red golden head level with his own. "Can you," whispered the old wizard, "can you truly hear the voice of the phoenix so clearly?" Harry was sobbing almost too hard to speak. For all the metal doors he'd passed, the voices he'd heard, the worst memories, the desperate begging as he walked away. All of it had burst into his mind like fire at the phoenix's scream, all the inner bulwarks smashed. Harry didn't know whether he could truly hear the voice of the phoenix so clearly, whether he would have understood Fawkes without already knowing. All Harry knew was that he had a plausible excuse to say the things Professor Quirrell had told him he must never raise in conversation from this day forth, because this was just what an innocent Harry would have said, would have done, if he had heard so clearly. "They're hurting, we have to help them." "I can't," cried Albus Dumbledore. "Harry, Fawkes, I can't, there's nothing I can do." Another piercing scream. Why not? Just go in and take them out. The old wizard wrenched his gaze from the phoenix, his eyes meeting Harry's instead. Harry, tell Fox for me. Tell him it's not that simple. Phoenixes aren't mere animals, but they are animals, Harry. They can't understand. I don't understand either, Harry said, his voice trembling. I don't understand why you're feeding people to Dementors. Azkaban isn't a prison, it's a torture chamber, and you're torturing those people to death. Percival, said the old wizard hoarsely. Percival Dumbledore, my own father, Harry. My own father died in Azkaban. I know it is a horror, but what would you have of me? To break Azkaban by force? Would you have me declare open rebellion against the ministry? Caw. There was a pause, and Harry's trembling voice said, Fox doesn't know anything about governments. He just wants you to take the prisoners out of their cells. And he'll help you fight if anyone stands in your way, and so will I, Headmaster. I'll go with you and destroy any Dementor that comes near. We'll worry about the political fallout afterward. I bet that you and I together could get away with it. Harry, whispered the old wizard, phoenixes do not understand how winning a battle can lose a war. Tears were streaming down the old wizard's cheeks, dripping into his silver beard. The battle is all they know. They are good, but not wise. That is why they choose wizards to be their masters. Can you bring out the Dementors to where I can get at them? Harry's voice was begging now. Bring them out in groups of 15. I think I could destroy that many at a time without hurting myself. The old wizard shook his head. It was hard enough to pass off the loss of one. They might give me one more. But never two. They are considered national possessions, Harry, weapons in case of war. Fury blazed in Harry then, blazed up like fire. It might have come from where a phoenix now rested on his own shoulder, and it might have come from his own dark side. And the two angers mixed within him, the cold and the hot, and it was a strange voice that said from his throat, Tell me something. What does a government have to do? What do the voters have to do with their democracy? What do the people of a country have to do before I ought to decide that I'm not on their side anymore? The old wizard's eyes widened where he stared at the boy with a phoenix upon his shoulder. Harry, are those your words, or the defense professor's? Because there has to be some point, doesn't there? And if it's not Azkaban, where is it then? Harry, listen, please, hear me. Wizards could not live together if they each declared rebellion against the whole every time they differed. Always there will be something. Azkaban is not just something, it's evil. Yes, even evil. Even some evils, Harry, for wizards are not perfectly good, and yet it is better that we live in peace than in chaos. And for you and I to break Azkaban by force would be the beginning of chaos. Can you not see it? The old wizard's voice was pleading. And it is possible to oppose the will of your fellows openly or in secret, without hating them, without declaring them evil and enemy. I do not think the people of this country deserve that of you, Harry. And even if some of them did, what of the children? What of the students in Hogwarts? What of the many good people mixed in with the bad? Harry looked on his shoulder at where Fawkes had perched, saw the phoenix's eyes gazing back at him. They did not glow, and yet they blazed, red flames in a sea of golden fire. What do you think, Fawkes? Caw, said the phoenix. Fawkes didn't understand the conversation. The young boy looked at the old wizard and said in a thick voice, Or maybe the phoenixes are wiser than us, smarter than us. Maybe they follow us around hoping that someday we'll listen to them, someday we'll get it. Someday we'll just take the prisoners out of their cells. Harry spun and pulled open the oaken door and stepped onto the staircase and slammed the door behind him. The stairwell began rotating. Harry began descending, and he put his face in his hands and began to weep. It wasn't until he was halfway to the bottom that he noticed the difference, noticed the warmth still spreading through him, and realized that, Fawkes, Harry whispered. The phoenix was still on his shoulder, perched there as he had seen him a few times upon Dumbledore's. Harry looked again into the eyes, red flames in golden fire. You're not my phoenix now, are you? Caw. Oh, Harry said, his voice trembling a little. I'm glad to hear that, Fawkes, because I don't think, the headmaster, I don't think he deserves. Harry stopped, took a breath. I don't think he deserves that, Fawkes. He was trying to do the right thing. Caw, but you're angry at him and trying to make a point. I understand. The phoenix nestled his head against Harry's shoulder, and the stone gargoyle walked smoothly aside to let Harry pass back into the corridors of Hogwarts. 63. Teasby Aftermaths. Aftermath, Hermione Granger. She was just starting to close up her books and put away her homework in preparation for sleep. Padma and Mandy stacking up their own books across the table from her, when Harry Potter walked into the Ravenclaw common room, and it was only then that she realized she hadn't seen him at all since breakfast. That realization was rapidly stomped on by a much more startling one. There was a golden red winged creature on Harry's shoulder, a bright bird of fire. And Harry looked sad and worn, and really tired like the phoenix was the only thing keeping him on his feet. But there was still a warmth about him. If you crossed your eyes, you might have thought you were looking at the headmaster somehow. That was the impression that went through Hermione's mind, even though it didn't make any sense. Harry Potter trudged across the Ravenclaw common room, past sofas full of staring girls, past card game circles of staring boys, heading for her. In theory, she wasn't talking to Harry Potter yet. His week wasn't up until tomorrow. But whatever was going on was clearly a whole lot more important than that. "Fox," Harry said, just as she was opening her mouth. "That girl over there is Hermione Granger. She's not talking to me right now because I'm an idiot. But if you want to be on a good person's shoulder, she's better than me." So much exhaustion and hurt in Harry Potter's voice. But before she could figure out what to do about it, the phoenix had glided off Harry's shoulder like a fire creeping up a matchstick on fast forward, flashing toward her. There was a phoenix flying in front of her and staring at her with eyes of light and flame. "Caw?" asked the phoenix. Hermione stared at it, feeling like she was facing a question on a test she'd forgotten to study for, the one most important question, and she'd gone her whole life without studying for it. She couldn't find anything to say. She said. "I'm only 12. I haven't done anything yet." The phoenix just glided gently around, rotating around one wingtip like the being of light and air that it was, and soared back to Harry Potter's shoulder, where it settled down quite firmly. "You silly boy," said Padma across from her, looking like she was deciding whether to laugh or grimace. "Phoenixes aren't for smart girls who do their homework. They're for idiots who charge straight at 5 older Slytherin bullies. There's a reason why the Gryffindor colors are red and gold, you know." There was a lot of friendly laughter in the Ravenclaw common room. Hermione wasn't one of the laughing ones. Neither was Harry. Harry had put a hand over his face. "Tell Hermione I'm sorry," he said to Padma, his voice almost fallen to a whisper. "Tell her I forgot that phoenixes are animals. They don't understand time and planning. They don't understand people who are going to do good things later. I'm not sure they understand really the notion of there being something that a person is. All they see is what people do. Fox doesn't know what 12 means. Tell Hermione I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. It just all goes wrong, doesn't it?" Harry turned to go, the phoenix still on his shoulder, began slowly trudging toward the staircase that led up to his dorm. And Hermione couldn't leave it at that. She just couldn't leave it at that. She didn't know if it was her competition with Harry or something else. She just couldn't leave it with the phoenix turning away from her. She had to her mind keyed a frantic question to the entirety of her excellent memory, found just one thing: I was going to run in front of the Dementor to try and save Harry. She shouted a little desperately at the red golden bird. I actually did start running and everything. That was stupid and courageous, right?" With a warbling cry, the phoenix launched itself from Harry's shoulder again, back toward her like a spreading blaze. It circled her 3 times like she was the center of an inferno. And for just a moment, its wing brushed against her cheek, before the phoenix soared back to Harry. There was a hush in the Ravenclaw common room. "Told you so," Harry said aloud, and then he started climbing the stairs up to his bedroom. He seemed to climb very quickly, like he was very light on his feet for some reason, so that in just a moment he and Fox were gone. Hermione held up a trembling hand to her cheek where Fox had brushed her with his wing, a spot of warmth lingering there like that one small patch of skin had been very gently set on fire. She'd answered the question of the phoenix, she supposed, but it felt to her like she'd just barely squeaked by on the test, like she'd gotten a 62, and she could have gotten 104 if she'd tried harder, if she'd tried at all. She hadn't really been trying when she thought about it, just doing her homework. Who have you saved? Aftermath, Fox. Nightmares, the boy had expected, screams and begging and howling hurricanes of emptiness, the discharge of the horrors being laid down into memory, and in that fashion, perhaps, becoming part of the past. and the boy knew that the nightmares would come. The next night they would come. The boy dreamed, and in his dreams the world was on fire. Hogwarts was on fire. His home was on fire. The streets of Oxford were on fire, all ablaze with golden flames that shone but did not consume, and all the people walking through the blazing streets were shining with white light brighter than the fire, like they were flames themselves or stars. The other first-year boys came to bed and saw it for themselves, the wonder whose rumor they had already heard, that in his bed Harry Potter lay silent and motionless, a gentle smile on his face, while perched on his pillow, a red golden bird watched over him, with bright wings swept above him like a blanket pulled over his head. The reckoning had been put off one more night. Aftermath, Draco Malfoy. Draco straightened his robes, making sure the green trim was straight. He waved his wand over his own head and said a charm that father had taught him while other children were still playing in mud, a charm which ensured that not a single speck of lint or dust would dirty his wizard's robes. Draco picked up the mysterious envelope that father had owled him and tucked it into his robes. He had already used Incendio and Everto on the mysterious note. And then he headed off to breakfast, to seat himself on exactly the same tick of the clock where the food appeared, if he could manage it, so that it would seem like all others had been waiting on his appearance to eat. Because when you were the scion of Malfoy, you were first in everything, including breakfast. That was why. Vincent and Gregory were waiting for him outside the door of his private room, up even before he was, though not, of course, dressed quite as sharply. The slithering common room was deserted. Anyone who got up this early was heading straight to breakfast anyway. The dungeon halls were silent, but for their own footsteps, empty and echoing. The great hall was a hubbub of alarm despite the relative few arrivals. Some younger children crying, students running back and forth between tables, or standing in knots shouting at each other. A red-robed prefect was standing in front of two green-trimmed students and yelling at them, and Snape was striding toward the mess. The noise dimmed a little as people caught sight of Draco, as some of the faces turned to stare at him and fell quiet. The food appeared on the tables. No one looked at it. And Snape spun on his heel, abandoning his target, and headed straight toward Draco. A knot of fear clutched at Draco's heart. Had something happened to Father? No. Surely Father would have told him. Whatever was happening, why hadn't Father told him? There were bags of fatigue beneath Snape's eyes. Draco saw as their head of house came close. The potion's master had never been a sharp dresser. That was an understatement. But his robes were even dirtier and more disarrayed this morning, spotted with extra grease. "You haven't heard," hissed their head of house as he came close. "For pity's sake, Malfoy, don't you have a newspaper delivered?" "What is it, Prof?" Bellatrix Black was taken from Azkaban. "What?" said Draco in shock, as Gregory behind him said something he really shouldn't have, and Vincent just gasped. Snape was gazing at him with narrowed eyes, then nodded abruptly. "Lucius told you nothing, then? I see." Snape gave a snort, turned away. "Professor," said Draco. The implications were just starting to dawn on him, his mind spinning frantically. "Professor, what should I do? Father didn't instruct me." "Then I suggest," Snape said sneeringly as he strode away, "that you tell them that, Malfoy, as your father intended." Draco glanced back at Vincent and Gregory, though he didn't know why he was bothering. Of course they looked even more confused than he did. And Draco walked forward to the Slytherin table and sat down at the far end, which was still empty of sitters. Draco put a sausage omelette on his plate, began eating it with automatic motions. Bellatrix Black had been taken from Azkaban. Bellatrix Black had been taken from Azkaban. Draco didn't know what to make of that. It was as totally unexpected as the sun going out well. The sun would expectedly go out in 6 billion years, but this was as unexpected as the sun going out tomorrow. Father wouldn't have done it. Dumbledore wouldn't have done it. No one should have been able to do it. What did it mean? What use would Bellatrix be to anyone after 10 years in Azkaban? Even if she got strong again, what use was a powerful sorceress who was completely evil and insane and fanatically devoted to a Dark Lord who wasn't around anymore? "Hey," said Vincent from where he was sitting next to Draco. "I don't understand, boss. Why'd we do that?" "We didn't do it, you dolt," snapped Draco. "Oh, for Merlin's sake, if even you think we didn't, your father ever tell you any stories about Bellatrix Black? She tortured Father once. She tortured your father. She's tortured everyone. The Dark Lord once told her to crucio herself, and she did it. She didn't do crazy things to inspire fear and obedience in the populace. She did crazy things because she's crazy. She's a bitch is what she is." "Oh, really?" said an incensed voice from behind Draco. Draco didn't look up. Gregory and Vincent would be watching his back. "I would have thought you'd be happy to hear that a Death Eater had been freed, Malfoy." Amicus Carrow had always been one of the other problem people. Father had once told Draco to make sure he was never alone in the same room with Amicus. Draco turned around and gave Flora and Hestia Carrow his number 3 sneer, the one that said that he was in a noble and most ancient house, and they weren't, and yes, that mattered. Draco said in their general direction, certainly not deigning to address them in particular, "There's Death Eaters and then there's Death Eaters," and then turned back to his food. There were 2 furious huffs in unison, and then 2 pairs of shoes stormed off toward the other end of the Slytherin table. It was a few minutes later that Millicent Bulstrode ran up to them, visibly out of breath, and said, "Mr. Malfoy, did you hear?" "About Bellatrix Black," said Draco. "Yeah, no, about Potter." "What?" "Potter was going around with a phoenix on his shoulder last night, looking like he'd been dragged through 10 leagues of mud. They say that the phoenix took him to Azkaban to try to stop Bellatrix, and he fought a duel with her and they blew up half the fortress." "What?" said Draco. Oh, there is just no way that Draco stopped. He'd said that a number of times about Harry Potter and had started to notice a trend. Millicent ran off to tell someone else. "You don't really think," said Gregory. "I honestly don't know anymore," said Draco. A few minutes later, after Theodore Nutt had sat down across from him and William Rosier had gone to sit with the Carrow twins, Vincent nudged him and said, "There." Harry Potter had entered the great hall. Draco watched him closely. There was no alarm on Harry's face as he saw, no surprise or shock. He just looked. It was the same distant, self-absorbed look Harry wore when he was trying to figure out the answer to a question Draco couldn't understand yet. Draco hastily shoved himself up from the bench of the Slytherin table, saying, "Stay behind," and walked with all decorous speed toward Harry. Harry seemed to notice his approach just as the other boy was turning toward the Ravenclaw table, and Draco gave Harry one quick look, and then walked right past him, straight out of the great hall. It was a minute later that Harry peered around the corner of the small stony nook where Draco had waited. It might not fool everyone, but it would create plausible deniability. "Quietus," said Harry. What Draco took the envelope out of his robes. "I have a message for you from Father." "Ha!" said Harry, and took the envelope from Draco and tore it open in a rather unneat manner and drew forth a sheet of parchment and unfolded it, and Harry gave a sharp intake of breath. Then Harry looked at Draco. Then Harry looked back down at the parchment. There was a pause. Harry said, "Did Lucius tell you to report on my reaction to this?" Draco paused for a moment, weighing, and then opened his mouth. "I see he did," said Harry, and Draco cursed himself. He should have known better, only it had been hard to decide. "What are you going to tell him?" "That you were surprised," said Draco. "Surprised," Harry said flatly. "Yeah, good, tell him that." "What is it?" said Draco. And then, as he saw Harry looking conflicted, "If you're dealing with Father behind my back," and Harry, without a word, gave Draco the paper. It said, "I know it was you." "What the I was going to ask you that," said Harry. "Have you got any idea what's up with your dad?" Draco stared at Harry. Then Draco said, "Did you do it?" "What?" said Harry. "What possible reason would I, how would I, did you do it, Harry?" "No," Harry said. "Of course not." Draco had listened carefully, but he hadn't detected any hesitation or tremor. So Draco nodded and said, "I've got no idea what Father's thinking, but it can't. I mean, it can't possibly be good. And people are also saying." "What?" said Harry warily. "Are they saying, Draco?" "Did a phoenix really take you to Azkaban to try to stop Bellatrix Black from escaping Aftermath?" Neville Longbottom Harry had only just sat down at the Ravenclaw table for the first time, hoping to grab a quick bite of food. He knew he needed to go off and think about things, but there was a tiny remaining bit of Phoenix's peace, even after the encounter with Draco, that he still wanted to cling to, some beautiful dream of which he remembered nothing but the beauty. And the part of him that wasn't feeling peaceful was waiting for all the anvils to finish dropping on him, so that when he went off to think and be by himself for a while, he could batch process all the disasters at once. Harry's hand grasped a fork, lifted a bite of mashed potatoes toward his mouth, and there was a shriek. Every now and then, someone would shout when they heard the news, but Harry's ears recognized this one. Harry was up from the bench in an instant, heading toward the Hufflepuff table, a horrible sick feeling dawning in the pit of his stomach. It was one of those things he hadn't considered when he decided to commit the crime, because Professor Quirrell had planned for no one to know. And now, afterward, Harry just hadn't thought of it. This, Hufflepuff said with bitter intensity, is also your fault. But by the time Harry got there, Neville was sitting down and eating fried sausage patties with snipperfig sauce. The Hufflepuff boy's hands were trembling, but he cut the food and ate it without dropping it. "Hello, General," Neville said, his voice wavering only slightly. "Did you fight a duel with Bellatrix Black last night?" "No," Harry said. His own voice was also wavery for some reason. "Didn't think so," said Neville. There was a scraping sound as his knife cut the sausage again. "I'm going to hunt her down and kill her. Can I count on you to help?" There were startled gasps from the mass of Hufflepuffs who had gathered around Neville. "If she comes after you," Harry said hoarsely, "if it was all a terrible mistake, if it was all a lie, I'll defend you even with my life. Won't let you get hurt for what I did, no matter what. But I won't help you go after her, Neville. Friends don't help friends commit suicide." Neville's fork paused on the way to his mouth. Then Neville put the bite of food in his mouth, chewed again, and Neville swallowed it. And Neville said, "I didn't mean right now, I mean after I graduate Hogwarts." "Neville," Harry said, keeping his voice under very careful control, "I think, even after you graduate, that might still be a just plain stupid idea. There's got to be much more experienced auras tracking her." "Oh, wait, that's not good. Listen to him," said Ernie Macmillan, and then an older-looking Hufflepuff girl standing close to Neville said, "Nevy, please, think about it, he's right." Neville stood up. Neville said, "Please don't follow me." Neville walked away from all of them, Harry and Ernie reaching out involuntarily toward him, and some of the other Hufflepuffs as well. And Neville sat down at the Gryffindor table, and distantly, though they had to strain to hear, they heard Neville say, "I'm going to hunt her down and kill her after I graduate. Anyone want to help?" And at least 5 voices said yes. And then Ron Weasley said loudly, "Get in line, you lot. I got an owl from Mum this morning. She says to tell everyone she's called dibs." And someone said Molly Weasley against Bellatrix Black. Who does she even think she's kidding? And Ron reached over to a plate and hefted a muffin. Someone tapped Harry on the shoulder, and he turned around and saw an unfamiliar green-trimmed older girl who handed him a parchment envelope and then quickly strode away. Harry stared at the envelope for a moment, then started walking toward the nearest wall. That wasn't very private, but it should be private enough, and Harry didn't want to give the impression of having much to hide. That had been a Slytherin system delivery, what you used if you wanted to communicate with someone without anyone else knowing that the two of you had talked. The sender gave an envelope to someone who had a reputation for being a reliable messenger, along with 10 nuts. That first person would take 5 nuts and pass the envelope to another messenger, along with the other 5 nuts. And the second messenger would open up that envelope and find another envelope with a name written on it and deliver that envelope to that person. That way, neither of the two people passing the message knew both the sender and the recipient, so no one else knew that those two parties had been in contact. When Harry reached the wall, he put the envelope inside his robes, opened it beneath the folds of cloth, and carefully snuck a peek at the parchment he drew forth. It said, "Classroom to the left of Transfiguration, 8 in the morning. LL." Harry stared at it, trying to remember if he knew anyone with the initials LL. His mind searched. "Retrieved the Quibbler girl," Harry whispered incredulously, and then shut his mouth. "She was only 10 years old. She shouldn't be in Hogwarts at all. Aftermath. Lesseth Lestrange." Harry was standing in the unused classroom next to Transfiguration at 8 a.m., waiting. He'd at least managed to get some food into himself before facing the next disaster, Luna Lovegood. The door to the classroom opened, and Harry saw and gave himself a really hard mental kick. One more thing he hadn't thought of, one more thing he really should have. The older boy's green-trimmed formal robes were askew. There were red spots on them looking very much like small darts of fresh blood, and one corner of his mouth had the look of a place that had been cut and healed by a pisky or some other minor medical charm that didn't quite erase all the damage. Lesseth Lestrange's face was streaked with tears, fresh tears and half-dried tears, and there was water in his eyes. a promise of still more on the way. Quietus, said the older boy, and then Hominem Revelio and some other things, while Harry thought frantically and without much luck. And then Lesseth lowered his wand and sheathed it in his robes, and slowly this time, formally, the older boy dropped to his knees on the dusty classroom floor, bowed his head all the way down until his forehead also touched the dust, and Harry would have spoken, but he was voiceless. Lesseth Lestrange said, in a breaking voice, "My life is yours, my lord, and my death as well." "I," Harry said. There was a huge lump in his throat, and he was having trouble speaking. "I didn't have anything to do with it. He should be saying right now." But then again the innocent Harry would have had trouble speaking too. "Thank you," whispered Lesseth. "Thank you, my lord. Oh, thank you." The sound of a choked-off sob came from the kneeling boy. All Harry could see of him was the hair on the back of his head, nothing of his face. "I'm a fool, my lord, an ungrateful bastard, unworthy to serve you. I cannot abase myself enough, for I shouted at you after you helped me, because I thought you were refusing me, and I didn't even realize until this morning that I'd been such a fool as to ask you in front of Longbottom." "I didn't have anything to do with it," Harry said. It was still very hard to tell an outright lie like that. Slowly, Lesseth raised his head from the floor, looked up at Harry. "I understand, my lord," said the older boy, his voice wavering a little. "You do not trust my cunning, and indeed I have shown myself a fool. I only wanted to say to you that I am not ungrateful, that I know it must have been hard enough to save only one person, that they're alerted now, that you can't get farther, but I am not ungrateful. I will never be ungrateful to you again. If ever you have a use for this unworthy servant, call me wherever I am, and I will answer, my lord. I was not involved in any way." But it got easier each time. Lesseth gazed up at Harry, said uncertainly, "Am I dismissed from your presence, my lord?" "I am not your lord." Lesseth said, "Yes, my lord, I understand," and pushed himself back up from the floor, stood straight and bowed deeply, then backed away from Harry until he turned to open the classroom door. As Lesseth's hand touched the doorknob, he paused. Harry couldn't see Lesseth's face as the older boy's voice said, "Did you send her to someone who would take care of her? Did she ask about me at all?" And Harry said, his voice perfectly level, "Please stop that. I was not involved in any way." "Yes, my lord, I'm sorry, my lord," said Lesseth's voice, and the Slytherin boy opened the door and went out and shut the door behind him. Feet sped up as he ran away, but not fast enough that Harry couldn't hear him start sobbing. Would I cry? Wondered Harry. If I knew nothing, if I was innocent, would I cry right now? Harry didn't know, so he just kept looking at the door. And some unbelievably tactless part of him thought, "Yay, we completed a quest and got a minion. Shut up. If you ever want to vote on anything ever again. Shut up." Aftermath, Amelia Bones. "Then his life isn't in danger, I take it," said Amelia. The healer, a stern-eyed old man who wore his robes white. He was a Muggle-born, and honoring some strange tradition of Muggles, of which Amelia had never asked, although privately she thought it made him look too much like a ghost, shook his head and said, "Definitely not." Amelia looked at the human form resting unconscious on the healer's bed, the burned and blasted flesh, the thin sheet that covered him for modesty's sake having been peeled back at her command. He might make a full recovery. He might not. The healer had said it was too early to say. Then Amelia looked at the other witch in the room, the detective. "And you say," Amelia said, "that the burning matter was transfigured from water, presumably in the form of ice." The detective nodded her head and said, sounding puzzled, "It could have been much worse if not for—" "How very nice of them," she spat, and then pressed a weary hand to her forehead. "No, no, it had been intended as a kindness." By the final stage of the escape, there would be no point in trying to fool anyone. Whoever had done this, then, had been trying to mitigate the damage, and they'd been thinking in terms of auras breathing the smoke, not of anyone being attacked with the fire. If it had been them still in control, no doubt, they would have steered the rocker more mercifully. But Bellatrix Black had ridden the rocker out of Azkaban alone. All the watching auras had agreed on that. They'd had their anti-disillusionment charms active, and there had been only one woman on that rocker, though the rocker had sported 2 sets of stirrups. Some good and innocent person, capable of casting the Patronus charm, had been tricked into rescuing Bellatrix Black. Some innocent had fought Barry one-hand, carefully subduing an experienced aura without significantly injuring him. Some innocent had transfigured the fuel for the Muggle artifact, on which the two of them had been to ride out of Azkaban, making it from frozen water for the benefit of her auras. And then their usefulness to Bellatrix Black had ended. You would have expected anyone capable of subduing Barry One Hand to have foreseen that part. But then you wouldn't have expected anyone who could cast the Patronus charm to try rescuing Bellatrix Black in the first place. Amelia passed her hand down over her eyes, closing them for a moment in silent mourning. I wonder who it was, and how you know who manipulated them. What story they could possibly have been told. She didn't even realize, until a moment later, that the thought meant she was starting to believe. Perhaps because, no matter how difficult it was to believe Dumbledore, it was becoming more difficult not to recognize the hand of that cold, dark intelligence. Aftermath Albus Dumbledore. It might have been only 57 seconds before breakfast ended, and he might have needed 4 twists of his time-turner. But in the end, Albus Dumbledore did make it. "Headmaster!" squeaked the polite voice of Professor Phileas Flitwick as the old wizard passed him by on his way to his seat. "Mr. Potter left a message for you." The old wizard stopped. He looked inquiringly at the charm's professor. "Mr. Potter said that after he woke up, he realized how unfair had been the things he said to you after Fawkes screamed. Mr. Potter said that he wasn't saying anything about anything else, just apologizing for that one part." The old wizard kept looking at his charms professor and still did not speak. "Headmaster," squeaked Phileas. "Tell him I said thank you," said Albus Dumbledore, "but that it is wiser to listen to phoenixes than to wise old wizards," and sat down at his place 3 seconds before all the food vanished. Aftermath, Professor Quirrell. "No," Madame Pomfrey snapped at the child. "You may not see him. You may not pester him. You may not ask him one little question. He is to rest in bed and do nothing for at least 3 days." Aftermath, Minerva McGonagall. She was heading toward the infirmary, and Harry Potter was leaving it when they passed each other. The look he gave her wasn't angry. It wasn't sad. It didn't say much at all. It was like he was looking at her just long enough to make it clear that he wasn't deliberately avoiding looking at her. And then he looked away before she could figure out what look to give him in return, as though he wanted to spare her that as well. He didn't say anything as he walked past her. Neither did she. What could there possibly be to say? Aftermath, Fred and George Weasley. They actually yelped out loud when they turned the corner and saw Dumbledore. It wasn't that the headmaster had popped up out of nowhere and was staring at them with a stern expression. Dumbledore was always doing that, but the wizard was dressed in formal black robes and looking very ancient and very powerful, and he was giving the two of them a sharp look. "Fred and George Weasley," spake Dumbledore in a voice of power. "Yes, headmaster," they said, snapping upright and giving him a crisp military salute they'd seen in some old pictures. "Hear me well. You are the friends of Harry Potter, is this so?" "Yes, headmaster. Harry Potter is in danger. He must not go beyond the wards of Hogwarts. Listen to me, sons of Weasley, I beg you listen. You know that I am as Gryffindor as yourselves, that I too know there are higher rules than rules. But this, Fred and George, this one thing is of the most terrible importance. There must be no exception this time, small or great. If you help Harry to leave Hogwarts, he may die. Does he send you on a mission, you may go. Does he ask you to bring him items, you may help. But if he asks you to smuggle his own person out of Hogwarts, you must refuse. Do you understand?" "Yes, headmaster." They said it without even thinking, really, and then exchanged uncertain looks with each other. The bright blue eyes of the headmaster were intent upon them. "No, not without thinking. If Harry asks you to bring him out, you must refuse. If he asks you to tell him the way, you must refuse. I will not ask you to report him to me, for that I know you would never do. But beg him on my behalf to go to me, if it is of such importance, and I will guard him as he walks. Fred, George, I am sorry to strain your friendship so, but it is his life." The two of them looked at each other for a long while, not communicating, only thinking the same things at the same time. They looked back at Dumbledore. They said, with a chill running through them as they spoke the name, "Bellatrix Black." "You may safely assume," said the headmaster, "that it is at least that bad." "Okay, got it." Aftermath, Alastor Moody and Severus Snape. When Alastor Moody had lost his eye, he had commandeered the services of a most erudite Ravenclaw, Samuel H. Lyle, whom Moody mistrusted slightly less than average. because Moody had refrained from reporting him as an unregistered werewolf, and he had paid Lyle to compile a list of every known magical eye and every known hint to their location. When Moody had gotten the list back, he hadn't bothered reading most of it, because at the top of the list was the Eye of Vance, dating back to an era before Hogwarts, and currently in the possession of a powerful dark wizard ruling over some tiny forgotten hellhole that wasn't in Britain or anywhere else. He'd have to worry about silly rules. That was how Alistair Moody had lost his left foot and acquired the Eye of Vance, and how the oppressed souls of Urulat had been liberated for a period of around 2 weeks before another dark wizard moved in on the power vacuum. He'd considered going after the left foot of Vance next, but had decided against it after he realized that would be just what they were expecting. Now Mad-Eye Moody was turning slowly, always turning, surveying the graveyard of Little Hangleton. It should have been a lot gloomier, that place, but in the broad daylight, it seemed like nothing but a grassy place marked by ordinary tombstones, demarcated by the chained twists of fragile, easily climbable metal that muggles used instead of wards. Moody could not comprehend what the muggles were thinking on that score, if they were pretending to have wards, or what, and he had decided not to ask whether muggle criminals respected the pretense. Moody didn't actually need to turn to survey the graveyard. The Eye of Vance saw the full globe of the world in every direction around him, no matter where it was pointing. But there was no particular reason to let a former Death Eater like Severus Snape know that. Sometimes people called Moody paranoid. Moody always told them to survive 100 years of hunting dark wizards and then get back to him about that. Mad-Eye Moody had once worked out how long it had taken him, in retrospect, to achieve what he now considered a decent level of caution, weighed up how much experience it had taken him to get good instead of lucky, and had begun to suspect that most people died before they got there. Moody had once expressed this thought to Lyle, who had done some ciphering and figuring, and told him that a typical dark wizard hunter would die, on average, 8.5 times along the way to becoming paranoid. This explained a great deal, assuming Lyle wasn't lying. Yesterday, Albus Dumbledore had told Mad-Eye Moody that the Dark Lord had used unspeakable dark arts to survive the death of his body, and was now awake and abroad, seeking to regain his power and begin the wizarding war anew. Someone else might have reacted with incredulity. "I can't believe you lot never told me about this resurrection thing," Mad-Eye Moody said, with considerable acerbity. "Do you realize how long it'll take me to do the grave of every ancestor of every dark wizard I've ever killed who could have been smart enough to make a Horcrux? You're not just now doing this one, are you?" "I redose this one every year," Severus Snape said calmly, uncapping the third flask of what the man had claimed would be 17 bottles, and beginning to wave his wand over it. "The other ancestral graves we've been able to locate were poisoned with only the long-lasting substances, since some of us have less free time than yourself." Moody watched the fluid spiraling out of the vial and vanishing to appear within the bones where Merrow had once been. "But you think it's worth the effort of the trap, instead of just vanishing the bones? He does have other avenues to life, should he perceive this one blocked," Snape said dryly, uncapping a fourth bottle. "And before you ask, it must be the original grave, the place of first burial, the bone removed during the ritual and not before. Thus he cannot have retrieved it earlier, and also there is no point in substituting the skeleton of a weaker ancestor. He would notice it had lost all potency." "Who else knows about this trap?" Moody demanded. "You, me, the headmaster, no one else." Moody snorted. "Fa, did Albus tell Amelia Bartemius and that McGonagall woman about the resurrection ritual?" "Yes, if Valdi finds out that Albus knows about the resurrection ritual and that Albus told them, Valdi'll figure that Albus told me, and Valdi knows I'd think of this." Moody shook his head in disgust. What were these other ways Valdi could come back to life? Snape's hand paused on the fifth bottle. It was all disillusioned, of course. The whole operation was disillusioned, but that meant less than nothing to Moody. It just marked you in his eyes sight as trying to hide. And the former Death Eater said, "You don't need to know." "You're learning, son," said Moody with mild approval. "What's in the bottles?" Snape opened the fifth bottle, gestured with his wand to begin the substance flowing toward the grave, and said, "This one, a muggle narcotic called LSD." A conversation yesterday put me in mind of Muggle things, and LSD seemed the most interesting option, so I hurried to obtain some. If it is incorporated into the resurrection potion, I suspect its effects will be permanent. What does it do? Said Moody. It is said that the effects are impossible to describe to anyone who has not used it, drawled Snape, and I have not used it. Moody nodded approval as Snape opened the sixth flask. What about that one? Love potion. Potion, said Moody. Not of the standard sort. It is meant to trigger a two-way bond with an unbearably sweet Vila woman named Verdandi, who the headmaster hopes might be able to redeem even him if they truly loved each other. Gah, said Moody. That bloody sentimental fool agreed, Severus Snape said calmly, his attention focused on his work. Tell me you've at least got some Malaclaw venom in there. Second flask. Iocane powder. Either the 14th or 15th bottle. Bile stupefaction, Moody said, naming an extremely addictive narcotic with interesting side effects on people with Slytherin tendencies. Moody had once seen an addicted dark wizard go to ridiculous lengths to get a victim to lay hands on a certain exact portkey, instead of just having someone toss the target a trapped nut on their next visit to town. After going to all that work, the addict had gone to the further effort to lay a second portus on the same portkey which had, on a second touch, transported the victim back to safety. To this day, even taking the drug into account, Moody could not imagine what could have possibly been going through the man's mind at the time he had cast the second portus. 10th vial, said Snape. Basilisk venom, offered Moody. What? Spat Snape. Snake venom is a positive component of the resurrection potion. Not to mention that it would dissolve the bone and all the other substances. And where would we even get? Calm down, son. I was just checking to see if you could be trusted. Mad-Eye Moody continued his secretly unnecessary, slow turning, surveying the graveyard, and the potion's master continued pouring. Hold on, Moody said suddenly. How do you know this is really where? Because it says Tom Riddle on the easily moved headstone, Snape said dryly. And I have just won 10 sickles from the headmaster, who bet you would think of that before the 5th bottle. So much for constant vigilance. There was a pause. How long did it take Albus to really? 3 years after we learned of the ritual, said Snape, in a tone not quite like his usual sardonic drawl. In retrospect, we should have consulted you earlier. Snape uncapped the 9th bottle. We poisoned all the other graves as well, with long-lasting substances, remarked the former Death Eater. It is possible that we are in the correct graveyard. He may not have planned this far ahead back when he was slaughtering his family, and he cannot move the grave itself. The true location doesn't look like a graveyard anymore, Moody said flatly. He moved all the other graves here, and memory charmed the Muggles. Not even Bellatrix Black would be told anything about that until just before the ritual started. No one knows the true location now except him. They continued their futile work. Aftermath blazed Zabini. The Slytherin common room could be accurately and precisely described as a remilitarized zone. The moment you stepped through the portrait hole, you would see that the left half of the room was definitely not talking to the right half and vice versa. It was very clear. It did not need to be explained to anyone that you did not have the option of not taking sides. At a table in the exact middle of the room, Blaise Zabini sat by himself, smirking as he did his homework. He had a reputation now and meant to keep it. Aftermath, Daphne Greengrass and Tracy Davis. You doing anything interesting today? Said Tracy. Nope, said Daphne. Aftermath, Harry Potter. If you went high enough in Hogwarts, you didn't see many other people around, just corridors and windows and staircases and the occasional portrait, and now and then some interesting sight, such as a bronze statue of a furry creature like a small child, holding a peculiar flat spear. If you went high enough in Hogwarts, you didn't see many other people around, which suited Harry. There were much worse places to be trapped, Harry supposed. In fact, you probably couldn't think of anywhere better to be trapped than an ancient castle with a fractal ever-changing structure that meant you couldn't ever run out of places to explore, full of interesting people and interesting books and incredibly important knowledge unknown to Muggle science. If Harry hadn't been told that he couldn't leave, he probably would have jumped at the chance to spend more time in Hogwarts. He would have plotted and connived to get it. Hogwarts was literally optimal, not in all the realms of possibility maybe, but certainly on the real planet Earth. It was the maximum fun location. How could the castle and its grounds seem so much smaller, so much more confining. How could the rest of the world become so much more interesting and important? The instant Harry had been told that he wasn't allowed to leave. He'd spent months here and hadn't felt claustrophobic then. You know the research on this, observed some part of himself. It's just standard scarcity effects, like that time where as soon as a county outlawed phosphate detergents, people who'd never cared before drove to the next county in order to buy huge loads of phosphate detergent. And surveys showed that they rated phosphate detergents as gentler and more effective and even easier pouring. And if you give 2-year-olds a choice between a toy in the open and one protected by a barrier they can go around, they'll ignore the toy in the open and go for the one behind the barrier. Salespeople know that they can sell things just by telling the customer it might not be available. It was all in Cialdini's book influence. Everything you're feeling right now. The grass is always greener on the side that's not allowed. If Harry hadn't been told that he couldn't leave, he probably would have jumped at the chance to stay at Hogwarts over the summer. But not the rest of his life. That was sort of the problem, really. Who knew whether there was still a Dark Lord Voldemort for him to defeat? Who knew whether he, who must not be named, still existed outside of the imagination of a possibly not just pretending to be crazy old wizard? Lord Voldemort's body had been found burned to a crisp. There couldn't really be such things as souls. How could Lord Voldemort still be alive? How did Dumbledore know that he was alive? And if there wasn't a Dark Lord, Harry couldn't defeat him, and he would be trapped in Hogwarts forever. Maybe he would be legally allowed to escape after he graduated his 7th year, 6 years and 4 months and 3 weeks from now. It wasn't that long as lengths of time went. It only seemed like long enough for protons to decay. Only it wasn't just that. It wasn't just Harry's freedom that was at stake. The headmaster of Hogwarts, the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, was quietly sounding the alarm. A false alarm. A false alarm which Harry had triggered. "You know," said the part of him that refined his skills, "didn't you sort of ponder once how every different profession has a different way to be excellent? How an excellent teacher isn't like an excellent plumber, but they all have in common certain methods of not being stupid, and that one of the most important such techniques is to face up to your little mistakes before they turn into big mistakes. Although this already seemed to qualify as a big mistake, actually. The point being," said his inner monitor, "it's getting worse literally by the minute. The way spies turn people is, they get them to commit a little sin, and then they use the little sin to blackmail them into a bigger sin, and then they use that sin to make them do even bigger things, and then the blackmailer owns their soul. Didn't you once think about how the person being blackmailed, if they could foresee the whole path, would just decide to take the punch on the first step, take the hit of exposing that first sin? Didn't you decide that you would do that? If anyone ever tried to blackmail you into doing something major in order to conceal something little? Do you see the similarity here, Harry James Potter Revensvers? Only it wasn't little. It already wasn't little. There would be a lot of very powerful people extremely angry at Harry, not just for the false alarm, but for freeing Bellatrix from Azkaban. If the Dark Lord did exist, and did come after him later, that war might already be lost. You don't think they'll be impressed by your honesty and rationality and foresight in stopping this before it snowballs even further? Harry did not, in fact, think this, and after a moment's reflection, whichever part of himself he was talking to had to agree that this was absurdly optimistic. His wandering feet took him near an open window, and Harry went over and leaned his arms on the ledge and stared down at the grounds of Hogwarts from high above. Brown that was barren trees, yellow that was dead grass, ice-colored ice that was frozen creeks and frozen streams. Whichever school official had dubbed it the Forbidden Forest really hadn't understood marketing. The name just made you want to go there even more. The sun was sinking in the sky, for Harry had been thinking for some hours now, thinking mostly the same thoughts over and over, but with key differences each time, like his thoughts were not going in circles, but climbing a spiral or descending it. He still couldn't believe that he'd gone through the entire thing with Azkaban. He'd switched off his Patronus before it took all his life. He'd stunned an aura. He'd figured out how to hide Bella from the Dementors. He'd faced down 12 Dementors and scared them away. He'd invented the rocket-assisted broomstick and ridden it. He'd gone through the entire thing without ever once rallying himself by thinking, I have to do this. Because I promised Hermione I'd come back from lunch. It felt like an irrevocably missed opportunity. Like, having done it wrong that time, he would never be able to get it right no matter what sort of challenge he faced next time, or what promise he made. Because then he would just be doing it awkwardly and deliberately to make up for having missed it the first time around, instead of making the heroic declarations he could have made if he'd remembered his promise to Hermione. Like that one wrong turn was irrevocable, you only got one chance, had to do it right on the first try. He should have remembered that promise to Hermione before going to Azkaban. Why had he decided to do that again? My working hypothesis is that you're stupid, said Hufflepuff. That is not a useful fault analysis, thought Harry. If you want a little more detail, said Hufflepuff, the defense professor of Hogwarts was all like, let's get Bellatrix Black out of Azkaban. And you were like, okay. Hold on, that's not fair, hey, said Hufflepuff. Notice how, once you're all the way up here, and the individual trees sort of blur together, you can actually see the shape of the forest. Why had he done it? Not because of any cost-benefit calculation, that was for sure. He'd been too embarrassed to pull out a sheet of paper and start calculating expected utilities. He'd worried that Professor Quirrell would stop respecting him if he said no, or even hesitated too much to help a maiden in distress. He'd thought, somewhere deep inside him, that if your mysterious teacher offered you the first mission, the first chance, the call to adventure, and you said no, then your mysterious teacher walked away from you in disgust, and you never got another chance to be a hero. Yeah, that had been it. In retrospect, that had been it. He'd gone and started thinking his life had a plot, and here was a plot twist, as opposed to, oh say, here was a proposal to break Bellatrix Black out of Azkaban. That had been the true and original reason for the decision in the split second where it had been made, his brain perceptually recognizing the narrative where he said no as dissonant. And when you thought about it, that wasn't a rational way to make decisions. Professor Quirrell's ulterior motive to obtain the last remains of Slytherin's lost lore, before Bellatrix died, and it was irrevocably forgotten, seemed impressively sane by comparison, a benefit commensurate with what had appeared at the time as a small risk. It didn't seem fair, that this was what happened if he lost his grip on his rationality for just a tiny fraction of a second, the tiny fraction of a second required for his brain to decide to be more comfortable with yes arguments than no arguments during the discussion that had followed. From high above, far enough above that the individual trees blurred together, Harry stared out at the forest. Harry didn't want to confess and ruin his reputation forever and get everyone angry at him and maybe end up killed by the Dark Lord later. He'd rather be trapped in Hogwarts for 6 years than face that. That was how he felt. And so it was in fact helpful, a relief, to be able to cling to a single decisive factor, which was that if Harry confessed, Professor Quirrell would go to Azkaban and die there. A catch, a break, a stutter in Harry's breathing, if you phrased it that way. Why, you could even pretend to be a hero instead of a coward. Harry lifted his eyes from the forbidden forest, looked up at the clear blue forbidden sky, stared out the glass panes at the big bright burning thing, the fluffy things, the mysterious endless blue in which they were embedded, that strange new unknown place. It actually did help. It helped quite a lot to think that his own troubles were nothing compared to being in Azkaban. That there were people in the world who were really in trouble, and Harry Potter was not one of them. What was he going to do about Azkaban? What was he going to do about magical Britain? Which side was he on now? In the bright light of day, everything that Albus Dumbledore had said certainly sounded a lot wiser than Professor Quirrell. Better and brighter, more moral, more convenient. Wouldn't it be nice if it were true? And the thing to remember was that Dumbledore believed things because they sounded nice, but Professor Quirrell was the one who was sane. Again, the catch in his breathing. It happened each time he thought of Professor Quirrell. But just because something sounded nice didn't make it wrong either. And if the defense professor did have a flaw in his sanity, it was that his outlook on life was too negative. Really? Inquired the part of Harry that had read 18 million experimental results about people being too optimistic and overconfident. Professor Quirrell is too pessimistic. So pessimistic that his expectations routinely undershoot reality. Stuff him and put him in a museum. He's unique. Which one of you two planned the perfect crime, and then put in all the error margin and fallbacks that ended up saving your butt, just in case the perfect crime went wrong? Hint, hint, his name wasn't Harry Potter. But pessimistic wasn't the correct word to describe Professor Quirrell's problem, if a problem it truly was, and not the superior wisdom of experience. But to Harry it looked like Professor Quirrell was constantly interpreting everything in the worst possible light. If you handed Professor Quirrell a glass that was 90% full, he'd tell you that the 10% empty part proved that no one really cared about water. That was a very good analogy, now that Harry thought about it. Not all of magical Britain was like Azkaban. That glass was well over half full. Harry stared up at the bright blue sky. Although, following the analogy, if Azkaban existed, then maybe it did prove that the 90% good part was there for other reasons, people trying to make a show of kindness, as Professor Quirrell had put it. For if they were truly kind, they would not have made Azkaban, they would storm the fortress to tear it down. Wouldn't they? Harry stared up at the bright blue sky. If you wanted to be a rationalist, you had to read an awful lot of papers on flaws in human nature, and some of those flaws were innocent logical failures, and some of them looked a lot darker. Harry stared up at the bright blue sky and thought of the Milgram experiment. Stanley Milgram had done it to investigate the causes of World War Roman II, to try to understand why the citizens of Germany had obeyed Hitler. So he had designed an experiment to investigate obedience, to see if Germans were, for some reason, more liable to obey harmful orders from authority figures. First, he'd run a pilot version of his experiment on American subjects, as a control, and afterward he hadn't bothered trying it in Germany. Experimental apparatus. A series of 30 switches set in a horizontal line with labels starting at 15 volts and going up to 450 volts with labels for each group of 4 switches. The first group of 4 labeled Slight Shock, the 6th group labeled Extreme Intensity Shock, the 7th group labeled Danger, Severe Shock, and the 2 last switches left over labeled just XXX. And an actor, a confederate of the experimenter, who had appeared to the true subjects to be someone just like them. Someone who had answered the same ad for participants in an experiment on learning, and who had lost a rigged lottery and been strapped into a chair, along with the electrodes. The true experimental subjects had been given a slight shock from the electrodes, just so that they could see that it worked. The true subject had been told that the experiment was on the effects of punishment on learning and memory, and that part of the test was to see if it made a difference what sort of person administered the punishment, and that the person strapped to the chair would try to memorize sets of word pairs, and that each time the learner got one wrong, the teacher was to administer a successively stronger shock. At the 300-volt level, the actor would stop trying to call out answers and begin kicking at the wall, after which the experimenter would instruct the subjects to treat non-answers as wrong answers and continue. At the 315-volt level, the pounding on the wall would be repeated. After that, nothing would be heard. If the subject objected or refused to press a switch, the experimenter, maintaining an impassive demeanor and dressed in a gray lab coat, would say, "Please continue." Then the experiment requires that you continue. Then it is absolutely essential that you continue. Then you have no other choice. You must go on. If the 4th prod still didn't work, the experiment halted there. Before running the experiment, Milgram had described the experimental setup, and then asked 14 psychology seniors what percentage of subjects they thought would go all the way up to the 450-volt level, what percentage of subjects would press the last of the 2 switches marked XXX after the victim had stopped responding. The most pessimistic answer had been 3%. The actual number had been 26 out of 40. The subjects had sweated, groaned, stuttered, laughed nervously, bitten their lips, dug their fingernails into their flesh. But at the experimenter's prompting, they had, most of them, gone on administering what they believed to be painful, dangerous, possibly lethal electrical shocks, all the way to the end. Harry could hear Professor Quirrell laughing, in his mind, the defense professor's voice saying something along the lines of, "Why, Mr. Potter, Even I had not been so cynical. I knew men would betray their most cherished principles for money and power, but I did not realize that a stern look also sufficed. It was dangerous to try and guess at evolutionary psychology if you weren't a professional evolutionary psychologist. But when Harry had read about the Milgram experiment, the thought had occurred to him that situations like this had probably arisen many times in the ancestral environment, and that most potential ancestors who tried to disobey authority were dead, or that they had, at least, done less well for themselves than the obedient. People thought themselves good and moral, but when push came to shove, some switch flipped in their brain, and it was suddenly a lot harder to heroically defy authority than they thought. Even if you could do it, it wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be some effortless display of heroism. You would tremble, your voice would break, you would be afraid. Would you be able to defy authority even then? Harry blinked then, because his brain had just made the connection between Milgram's experiment and what Hermione had done on her first day of defense class. She'd refused to shoot a fellow student, even when authority had told her that she must. She had trembled and been afraid, but she had still refused. Harry had seen that happen right in front of his own eyes, and he still hadn't made the connection until now. Harry stared down at the reddening horizon. The sun was sinking lower, the sky fading, darkening. Even if most of it was still blue, soon it would turn to night. The gold and red colors of sun and sunset reminded him of Fawkes, and Harry wondered, for a moment, if it must be a sad thing to be a phoenix and call and cry and scream without being heeded. But Fawkes would never give up. As many times as he died, he would always be reborn, for Fawkes was a being of light and fire, and despairing over Azkaban belonged to the darkness just as much as did Azkaban itself. If you were given a glass half empty and half full, then that was the way reality was. That was the truth, and it was so. But you still had a choice of how to feel about it, whether you would despair over the empty half or rejoice in the water that was there. Milgram had tried certain other variations on his test. In the 18th experiment, the experimental subject had only needed to call out the test words to the victim strapped into the chair and record the answers while someone else pressed the switches. It was the same apparent suffering, the same frantic pounding followed by silence, but it wasn't you pressing the switch. You just watched it happen and read the questions to the person being tortured. 37 of 40 subjects had continued their participation in that experiment to the end. The 450-volt end marked XXX. And if you were Professor Quirrell, you might have decided to feel cynical about that. But 3 out of 40 subjects had refused to participate all the way to the end. The Hermiones. They did exist, in the world, the people who wouldn't fire a simple strike hex at a fellow student, even if the defense professor ordered them to do it. The ones who had sheltered gypsies and Jews and homosexuals in their attics during the Holocaust, and sometimes lost their lives for it. And were those people from some other species than humanity? Did they have some extra gear in their heads, some additional chunk of neural circuitry, which lesser mortals did not possess? But that was not likely, given the logic of sexual reproduction, which said that the genes for complex machinery would be scrambled beyond repair if they were not universal. Whatever parts Hermione was made from, everyone had those same parts inside them somewhere. Well, that was a nice thought, but it wasn't strictly true. There was such a thing as literal brain damage. People could lose genes, and the complex machine could stop working. There were sociopaths and psychopaths, people who lacked the gear to care. Maybe Lord Voldemort had been born like that, or maybe he had known good and yet still chosen evil. At this point, it didn't matter in the slightest. But a supermajority of the population ought to be capable of learning to do what Hermione and Holocaust resistors did. The people who had been run through the Milgram experiment, who had trembled and sweated and nervously laughed as they went all the way to pressing the switches marked XXX. Many of them had written to thank Milgram afterward for what they had learned about themselves. That, too, was part of the story, the legend of that legendary experiment. The sun had almost sunk below the horizon now, a last golden tip peeking above the faraway tops of trees. Harry looked at it, that tip of sun. His glasses were supposed to be proof against UV, so he ought to be able to look directly at it without damaging his eyes. Harry stared directly at it, that tiny fraction of the light, that was not obscured and blocked and hidden. Even if it was only 3 parts out of 40, the other 37 parts were there somewhere. The 75% of the glass that was full, which proved that people really did care about water, even if that force of caring within themselves was too often defeated. If people truly didn't care, the glass would have been truly empty. If everyone had been like you-know-who inside, secretly cleverly selfish, there would have been no resistors to the Holocaust at all. Harry looked at the sunset, on the second day of the rest of his life, and knew that he had switched sides. Because he couldn't believe in it anymore. He couldn't really, not after going to Azkaban. He couldn't do what 37 out of 40 people would vote for him to do. Everyone might have inside them what it took to be Hermione, and someday they might learn. But someday wasn't now, not here, not today, not in the real world. If you were on the side of 3 out of 40 people, then you weren't a political majority, and Professor Quirrell had been right. Harry would not bow his head in submission when that happened. There was a sort of awful appropriateness to it. You shouldn't go to Azkaban and come back having not changed your mind about anything important. So is Professor Quirrell right then? Asked Slytherin. Leaving out whether he's good or evil, is he right? Are you, to them, whether they know it or not, their next lord? We'll just leave out the dark part. That's him being cynical again. But is it your intention now to rule? I've got to say, that makes even me nervous. Do you think you can be trusted with power? Said Gryffindor. Isn't there some sort of rule that people who want power shouldn't have it? Maybe we should make Hermione the ruler instead. Do you think you're fit to run a society and not have it collapse into total chaos inside of 3 weeks flat? Said Hufflepuff. Imagine how loudly Mum would scream if she'd heard you'd been elected Prime Minister. Now ask yourself, are you sure she's wrong about that? Actually, said Ravenclaw, I have to point out that all this political stuff sounds overwhelmingly boring. How about if we leave all the electioneering to Draco and stick to science? It's what we're actually good at, and that's been known to improve the human condition too, you know. Slow down, thought Harry at his components. We don't have to decide everything right now. We're allowed to ponder the problem as fully as possible before coming to a solution. The last part of the sun sank below the horizon. It was strange, this feeling of not quite knowing who you were, which side you were on, of having not already made up your mind about something as major as that. There was an unfamiliar sensation of freedom in it. And that reminded him of what Professor Quirrell had said to his last question, which reminded him of Professor Quirrell, which made it hard once more to breathe, started that burning sensation in Harry's throat, sent his thoughts around that loop of the climbing spiral once again. Why was he so sad now, whenever he thought of Professor Quirrell? Harry was used to knowing himself, and he didn't know why he felt so sad. It felt like he'd lost Professor Quirrell forever, lost him in Azkaban. That was how it felt. As surely as if the defense professor had been eaten by dementors, consumed in the empty voids. Lost him. Why did I lose him? Because he said Avada Kedavra, and there was in fact a perfectly good reason, even though I didn't see it for a couple of hours. Why can't things go back to the way they were? But then it hadn't been the Avada Kedavra. That might have played a part in irreversibly collapsing a structure of rationalizations and flinches and carefully not thinking about certain things. But it hadn't been the Avada Kedavra, that hadn't been the disturbing thing that Harry had seen. What did I see? Harry looked at the fading sky. He'd seen Professor Quirrell turn into a hardened criminal while facing the aura, and the apparent change of personalities had been effortless and complete. Another woman had known the defense professor as Jeremy Jaff. How many different people are you anyway? I cannot say that I bothered keeping count. You couldn't help but wonder whether Professor Quirrell was just one more name on the list, just one more person that had been turned into, made up in the service of some unguessable goal. Harry would always be wondering now, every time he talked to Professor Quirrell, if it was a mask, and what motive was behind that mask. With every dry smile, Harry would be trying to see what was pulling the levers on the lips. Is that how other people will start thinking of me if I get too Slytherin? If I pull off too many plots, will I never be able to smile at anyone again without them wondering what I really mean by it? Maybe there was some way to restore a trust in surface appearances and make a normal human relationship possible again. But Harry couldn't think of what it might be. That was how Harry had lost Professor Quirrell, not the person, but the connection. Why did that hurt so much? Why did it feel so lonely now? Surely there were other people, maybe better people, to trust and befriend. Professor McGonagall, Professor Flitwick, Hermione, Draco, not to mention Mum and Dad. It wasn't like Harry was alone. Only a choking sensation grew in Harry's throat as he understood. Only Professor McGonagall, Professor Flitwick, Hermione, Draco, they all of them sometimes knew things that Harry didn't, but they did not excel above Harry within his own sphere of power. Such genius as they possessed was not like his genius, and his genius was not like theirs. He might look upon them as peers, but not look up to them as his superiors. None of them had been, none of them could ever be, Harry's mentor. That was who Professor Quirrell had been. That was who Harry had lost. And the manner in which he had lost his first mentor might or might not allow Harry to ever get him back. Maybe someday he would know all Professor Quirrell's hidden purposes, and the doubts between them would go away. But even if that seemed possible, it didn't seem very probable. There was a gust of wind outside Hogwarts. It bent the empty trees, rippled the lake whose heart was still unfrozen, made a whispering sound as it slid past the window that looked upon the half-twilight world, and Harry's thoughts wandered outward for a time, then returned inward again to the next step of the spiral. Why am I different from the other children my age? If Professor Quirrell's answer to that had been an evasion, then it was a very well-calculated one. Deep enough and complex enough, sufficiently full of suggestions of hidden meaning to serve as a trap for a Ravenclaw who couldn't be diverted by less. Or maybe Professor Quirrell had meant his answer honestly. Who knew what motive might have pulled that lever on those lips? I will say this much, Mr. Potter. You are already an Occlumens, and I think you will become a perfect Occlumens before long. Identity does not mean, to such as us, what it means to other people. Anyone we can imagine, we can be. And the true difference about you, Mr. Potter, is that you have an unusually good imagination. A playwright must contain his characters. He must be larger than them in order to enact them within his mind. To an actor or spy or politician, the limit of his own diameter is the limit of who he can pretend to be, the limit of which face he may wear as a mask. But for such as you and I, anyone we can imagine, we can be in reality and not pretense. While you imagined yourself a child, Mr. Potter, you were a child. Yet there are other existences you could support, larger existences if you wished. Why are you so free and so great in your circumference when other children your age are small and constrained? Why can you imagine and become selves more adult than a mere child of a playwright should be able to compose? That I do not know, and I must not say what I guess. But what you have, Mr. Potter, is freedom. If that was a snow job, it was one heck of a distracting one. And the still more worrisome thought was that Professor Quirrell hadn't realized how disturbed Harry would be, how wrong that speech would sound to him, how much damage it would do to his trust in Professor Quirrell. There ought to always be one real person who you truly were at the center of everything. Harry stared out at the falling night, the gathering darkness. Right. It was almost bedtime when Hermione heard the scattered intakes of breath and looked up from her copy of Beauxbatons, a history to see the missing boy, the boy who had been misplaced at lunch that Sunday, whose dinner non-appearance had been accompanied by rumors, and she hadn't believed them because they were completely ridiculous, but she felt a little queasiness inside that he'd withdrawn from Hogwarts in order to hunt down Bellatrix Black. Harry. She shrieked. She didn't even realize that she was talking directly to him for the first time in a week, or notice how some other students started at the sound of her yelling all the way across the Ravenclaw common room. Harry's eyes had already lifted to her. He was already walking toward her, so she stopped halfway out of her chair. A few moments later, Harry was seated across from her, and he was putting away his wand after casting a quieting barrier around them. And an awful lot of Ravenclaws were trying not to look like they were watching. Hey, Harry said. His voice wavered. I missed you. You're going to talk to me again now. Hermione nodded. She just nodded. She couldn't think of what to say. She'd missed Harry too, but she was realizing with a guilty sort of feeling that it might have been a lot worse for him. She had other friends, Harry. It didn't feel fair sometimes that Harry talked to only her like that, so that she had to talk to him. But Harry had a look about him like unfair things had been happening to him too. What's been going on? She said. There's all sorts of rumors. There were people saying you'd run off to fight Bellatrix Black. There were people saying you'd run off to join Bellatrix Black. And those rumors had said that Hermione had just made up the thing about the Phoenix, and she'd yelled that the whole Ravenclaw common room had seen it. So then the next rumor had claimed she'd made up that part too, which was stupidity of such an inconceivable level that it left her completely flabbergasted. "I can't talk about it," Harry said in a bare whisper. "Can't talk about a lot of it. I wish I could tell you everything," his voice wavered, "but I can't. I guess if it helps or anything, I'm not going to lunch with Professor Quirrell anymore." Harry put his hands over his face, then covering his eyes. Hermione felt the queasy feeling all through her stomach. "Are you crying?" said Hermione. "Yeah," said Harry, his voice sounding a little breathy. "I don't want anyone else to see." There was a little silence. Hermione wanted to help, but she didn't know what to do about a boy crying, and she didn't know what was happening. She felt like huge things were happening around her, no, around Harry, and if she knew what they were, she would probably be scared, or alarmed, or something, but she didn't know anything. "Did Professor Quirrell do something wrong?" she said at last. "That's not why I can't go to lunch with him anymore," Harry said, still in that bare whisper with his hands pressed over his eyes. "That was the headmaster's decision. But yeah, Professor Quirrell said some things to me that made me trust him less, I guess." Harry's voice sounded very shaky. "I'm feeling kind of alone right now." Hermione put her hand on her cheek where Fox had touched her yesterday. She kept thinking about that touch, over and over, maybe because she wanted it to be important, to mean something to her. "Is there any way I can help?" she said. "I want to do something normal," Harry said from behind his hands. "Something very normal for first-year Hogwarts students. Something 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds like us are supposed to do, like play a game of exploding snap or something. I don't suppose you have the cards or know the rules or anything like that." I don't know the rules, actually," said Hermione. "I know they explode. I don't suppose gobstones," said Harry. "Don't know the rules and they spit at you." "Those are boy games, Harry." There was a pause. Harry ground his hands against his face to wipe it, and then took his hands away, and then he was looking at her, looking a little helpless. "Well," Harry said, "what do wizards and witches our age do when they play, the kind of pointless, silly games we're supposed to play at this age?" "Hopscotch," said Hermione. "Jump rope, unicorn attack. I don't know, I read books." Harry started laughing, and Hermione started giggling along with him, even though she didn't know quite why, but it was funny. "I guess that helped a little," said Harry. "Actually, I think it helped more than playing gobstones for an hour could have possibly helped, so thanks for being you. And no matter what, I'm not having anyone obliviate everything I know about calculus. I'd sooner die." "What?" said Hermione. Why would you ever want to do that?" Harry stood up from the table, and there was a rush of restored background noise as his rise broke the quieting charm. "I'm a tad sleepy, so I'm going off to bed," Harry said. Now his voice was ordinary and wry. "I've got some lost time to make up for, but I'll see you at breakfast, and then at herbology if that's all right. Not to mention it wouldn't be fair to dump all my depression on you. G-night, Hermione." "Good night, Harry," she said, feeling very confused and alarmed. "Pleasant dreams." Harry stumbled a little as she said that, and then he continued on toward the stairs that led to the first-year boys' dorms. Harry turned the quieting charm all the way up, on the head of his bedboard, so that he wouldn't wake anyone else up if he screamed. Set his alarm to wake him up for breakfast, if he wasn't up already by that hour, if indeed he slept at all. Got into bed, laid down, felt the lump beneath his pillow. Harry stared up at the canopy above his bed. Hissed under his breath, "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." It took a few seconds before Harry could muster the heart to sit up in bed, pull the blanket over himself and his pillow to obscure the deed from the other boys, cast a low-intensity lumos, and see what was under his pillow. There was a parchment and a deck of playing cards. The parchment read, "A little bird told me that Dumbledore has shut the door of your cage. I must admit, on this occasion, that Dumbledore may have a point. Bellatrix Black is loosed upon the world once more, and that is not good news for any good person. If I stood in Dumbledore's place, I might well do the same. But just in case, the Salem Witches' Institute in America accepts boys as well, despite the name. They are good people and would protect you even from Dumbledore if you needed it. Britain holds that you need Dumbledore's permission to emigrate to magical America, but magical America disagrees. So in the final extremity, get outside the wards of Hogwarts and tear in half the King of Hearts from this deck of cards. That you should resort to it only in the final extremity goes without saying. Be well, Harry Potter. Santa Claus Harry stared down at the pack of cards. It couldn't take him anywhere else, not right now. Portkeys didn't work here. But he still felt unnerved about the prospect of picking it up, even to hide it inside his trunk. Well, he'd already picked up the parchment, which could just as easily have been enchanted with a trap, if a trap was involved. But still. Wingardium Leviosa, Harry whispered, and hovered the packet of cards to lie next to where his alarm clock rested in a pocket of the headboard. He'd deal with it tomorrow. And then Harry lay back in bed and closed his eyes to dream without any phoenix to protect him and pay his reckoning. He came awake with a gasp of horror, not a scream. He'd yet to scream this night. But his blanket was all tangled around him from where his sleeping form had jerked as he dreamed of running, trying to get away from the gaps in space that were pursuing him through a corridor of metal lit by dim gaslight, an endlessly long corridor of metal lit by dim gaslight. And he hadn't known, in the dream, that touching those voids meant he would die horribly and leave his still-breathing body empty behind him. All he'd known was that he had to run and run, and run from the wounds in the world sliding after him. Harry started to cry again. It wasn't for the horror of the chase. It was that he'd run away while someone behind him was screaming for help, screaming for him to come back and save her, help her. She was being eaten. She was going to die. And in the dream, Harry had run away instead of helping her. "Don't go." The voice came in a scream from behind the metal door. No, 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 don't go, don't take it away, don't. Why had Fawkes ever rested on his shoulder? He'd walked away. Fawkes should hate him. Fawkes should hate Dumbledore. He'd walked away. Fawkes should hate everyone. The boy wasn't awake, wasn't dreaming. His thoughts were jumbled and confused in the shadowlands that bordered sleep and waking, unprotected by the safety rails that his aware mind imposed on itself, the careful rules and censors. In that shadowland his brain had woken up enough to think, but something else was too sleepy to act. His thoughts ran free and wild, unconstrained by his self-concept, his waking self's ideals of what he shouldn't think. That was the freedom of his brain's dreams, as his self-concept slept. Free to repeat, over and over, Harry's new worst nightmare. No, I didn't mean it, please don't die. No, I didn't mean it, please don't die. No, I didn't mean it, please don't die. A rage grew in him alongside the self-loathing, a terrible hot wrath/icy cold hatred, for the world which had done that to her/ for himself. And in his half-awake state, Harry fantasized escapes, fantasized ways out of the moral dilemma. He imagined himself hovering above the vast, triangular horror of Azkaban, and whispering an incantation unlike any syllables that had ever been heard before on Earth. Whispers that echoed all the way across the sky and were heard on the other side of the world. And there was a blast of silver Patronus fire, like a nuclear explosion that tore apart all the Dementors in an instant and ripped apart the metal walls of Azkaban, shattered the long corridors and all the dim orange lights. And then a moment later his brain remembered that there were people in there, and rewrote the half-dream fantasy to show all the prisoners laughing as they flew away in flocks from the burning wreck of Azkaban, the silver light restoring the flesh to their limbs as they flew. And Harry started crying harder into his pillow, because he couldn't do it, because he wasn't God. He'd sworn upon his life and magic and his art as a rationalist. He'd sworn by all he held sacred and all his happy memories. He'd given his oath, so now he had to do something, had to do something. Had to do something. Maybe it was pointless. Maybe trying to follow rules was pointless. Maybe you just burned down Azkaban, however. And in fact, he'd sworn he'd do it, so now that was what he had to do. He'd just do whatever it took to get rid of Azkaban, that was all. If that meant ruling Britain, fine. If that meant finding a spell to whisper that would echo all across the sky, whatever, the important thing was to destroy Azkaban. That was the side he was on. That was who he was, so there, it was done. His waking mind would have demanded a lot more details before accepting that as an answer, but in his half-dreaming state, it felt like enough of a resolution to let his tired mind fall truly asleep again and dream the next nightmare. Final aftermath. She came awake with a gasp of horror, a disruption of her breathing that left her feeling deprived of air, and yet her lungs didn't move. She woke up with an unvoiced scream on her lips, and no words came forth, for she could not understand what she had seen. She could not understand what she had seen. It was too large for her to encompass and still taking shape. She could not put words to that formless shape, and so she could not discharge it. Could not discharge it and become innocent and unknowing once more. "What time is it?" she whispered. Her golden jeweled alarm clock, the beautiful and magical and expensive alarm clock that the headmaster had given her as a gift upon her employment at Hogwarts, whispered back, "Around 2 in the morning. Go back to sleep." Her sheets were soaked in sweat, her nightclothes soaked in sweat. She took her wand from beside the pillow and cleaned herself up before she tried to go back to sleep. She tried to go back to sleep and eventually succeeded. Sybil Trelawney went back to sleep. 64. I make files 4, alternate parallels. If you're 5 hours past your bedtime and still reading this, may I suggest getting some sleep? The fic will still be here tomorrow. Unless, something bad happens to it, and the next morning there's just a 404 at this address, and you're left with nothing but a fading memory and an eternal regret that you didn't stay awake longer and keep reading while you still had the chance. But hey, how probable is that? This story spreads by blogging, tweeting, word of mouth, favoriting, plugging on forums, and adding to lists. And remember, if the readers before you hadn't taken a moment to do that, you probably wouldn't have found this. If that's not enough to motivate you, then let me add that if you don't help spread rationality, Hermione will be sad. You don't want her to be sad, right? Don't forget to visit lesswrong.com and read the sequences, the true existence of which this fic is but a shadow. I recommend starting with the sequence How to Actually Change Your Mind. And now, with all universes owned by their respective creators, I present Armake Files 4. The other fanfictions you could have been reading. Lord of the Rationality. Frodo glanced at all the faces, but they were not turned to him. All the council sat with downcast eyes, as if in deep thought. A great dread fell on him, as if he was awaiting the pronouncement of some doom that he had long foreseen and vainly hoped might after all never be spoken. An overwhelming longing to rest and remain at peace by Bilbo's side in Rivendell filled all his heart. At last, with an effort, he spoke, and wondered to hear his own words, as if some other will was using his small voice. "We cannot," said Frodo. "We must not. Do you not see? It is exactly what the enemy desires. All of this he has foreseen." The faces turned to him, puzzled the dwarves and grave the elves, sternness in the eyes of the men, and so keen the gazes of Elrond and of Gandalf that Frodo almost could not withstand it. It was very hard, then, not to grasp the ring in his hand, and harder still not to put it on, to face them as only Frodo. "Do you not question it?" Frodo said, thin like the wind his voice, and wavering like a breeze. "You have chosen, of all things, to send the ring into Mordor, should you not wonder? How did it come to this? That we might, of all our choices, do that single thing our enemy most desires. Perhaps the cracks of doom are already guarded, strongly enough to hold off Gandalf and Elrond and Glorfindel altogether. Or perhaps the master of that place has cooled the lava there, set it to trap the ring so that he may simply bring it out after it is thrown in." A memory of awful clarity came over Frodo then, and a flash of black laughter, and the thought came to him that it was just what the enemy would do. Only the thought came to him so. Thus it would amuse me to do, if I meant to rule. There were doubtful glances exchanged within the council. Gloin and Gimli and Boromir were now looking at the elves more skeptically than before, like they had awoken out of a dream of words. "The enemy is very wise," said Gandalf, "and weighs all things to a nicety in the scales of his malice. But the only measure that he knows is desire, desire for power, and so he judges all hearts. Into his heart the thought will not enter that any will refuse it, that having the ring we may seek to destroy it. He will think of it," cried Frodo. He struggled for words, trying to convey things that had once seemed perfect in his comprehension, and then faded like melting snow. If the enemy thought that all his foes were moved by desire for power alone, he would guess wrongly over and over, and the maker of this ring would see that. He would know that somewhere he had made a mistake. Frodo's hands stretched forth pleadingly. Boromir stirred, and his voice was doubtful. "You speak fair of the enemy," said Boromir, "for one of his foes." Frodo's mouth opened and shut in desperate bewilderment, for Frodo knew, he knew the man was mad, but he could think of nothing to say. Then Bilbo spoke, and his withered voice silenced the whole room, even Elrond, who had been about to speak. Frodo is right, I fear, whispered the old hobbit. I remember what it was like, to see with the black sight. I remember. The enemy will think that we might not trust one another, that the weaker among us will propose to destroy the ring so that the stronger may not have it. He knows that even one not truly good might still cry to destroy the ring, to make a show of pretended goodness. And the enemy will not think it impossible that such a decision be made by this council, for you see, he does not trust us to be wise. A whispering chuckle rose from the ancient hobbit's throat. And if he did why, he would still guard the cracks of doom. It would cost him little. Now foreboding was on the faces even of the elves, and the wise. Elrond had frowned, and the sharp eyebrows of Gandalf furrowed. Frodo gazed at them all, feeling a wildness come over him, a despair. And as his heart weakened, a shadow came over his vision, a darkness and a wavering. From within the shadow, Frodo saw Gandalf, and the wizard's strength was revealed as weakness, and his wisdom folly. For Frodo knew, as the ring seemed to drag and weigh on his breast, that Gandalf had not thought at all of history and lore, when the wizard spoke of how the enemy would not understand any desire save power, that Gandalf had not remembered how Sauron had cast down and corrupted the men of Númenor in the days of their glory, just as it had not occurred to Gandalf that the enemy might learn to comprehend foes of good will by looking. Frodo's gaze swung to Elrond, but there was no hope there, no answer and no rescue in the shadowy vision. For Elrond had let Isildur go, carrying the ring from the cracks of doom where it should have been destroyed, to the cost of all this war. Not for Isildur's own sake, not for friendship had it been done, for the ring had killed Isildur in the end, and far worse fates could have followed him. But the doom that had stemmed from Isildur's deed would have seemed unsure to Elrond then, unsure and distant in time. And yet the cost to Elrond himself of taking his sword's pommel to the back of Isildur's head would have been surer and nearer. As though in desperation, Frodo turned to look at Aragorn, the weathered man who had donned his travel-worn clothes for this council, the heir of kings who spoke softly to hobbits. But Frodo's vision seemed to double, and in the shadowy second image, Frodo saw a man who had spent too much of his youth among elves, who had learned to wear humble and stained clothes amid the gold and jewels, knowing he could not match them wisdom for wisdom, and hoping to outplay them in a fashion they would not emulate. In the sight of the ring, which was the sight of the ring's own maker, all noble things faded into stratagems and lies, a world of grey and darkness without any light. They had not made their choices knowingly, Gandalf or Elrond or Aragorn. The impulses had come from the dark hidden parts of themselves, the black secret depths which the ring had rendered plain in Frodo's vision. Would they outthink the shadow when they could not comprehend even their own selves or the forces that moved them? Frodo! Came the sharp whisper of Bilbo's voice, and Frodo came to himself, and halted his hand reaching up toward where the ring lay on his breast, on its chain, dragging like a vast stone around his neck, reaching up to grasp the ring wherein all answers lay. How did you bear this thing? Frodo whispered to Bilbo, as if the two of them were the only souls in the room, though all the council watched them. For years, I cannot imagine it. I kept it locked in a room to which only Gandalf had the key, said his uncle, and when I began to imagine ways to open it, I remembered Gollum. A shudder went through Frodo, remembering the tales, the horror of the misty mountains, thinking, always thinking in the dark, ruling the goblins from the shadows and filling the tunnels with traps. But for Bilbo wearing the ring that first time not a single dwarf would have lived. And now, Legolas the elf had told them, Gollum had given up on sending his agents against the Shire, had at last found the courage to leave his mountains and seek the ring himself. That was Gollum, the fate which Frodo would share himself if the ring were not destroyed. Only they had no way to destroy the ring. The shadow had foreseen every move they could make. Had almost Frodo still could not imagine how it had been done, how the shadow had arranged such a thing, had almost maneuvered the council into sending the ring straight into Mordor with only a tiny guard set on it, as they would have done if Frodo and Bilbo had not been there. And having foregone that swiftest of all possible defeats, the only question remaining was how long it would take to lose. Gandalf had delayed too long, delayed far too long to set this march in motion. It could have been so easy, if only Bilbo had set out 80 years earlier, If only Bilbo had been told what Gandalf had already suspected. If only Gandalf's heart had not silently flinched away from the prospect of being embarrassingly wrong. Frodo's hand spasmed on his breast. Without thought, his fingers began to rise again toward the vast weight of the chain on which the ring hung. All he had to do was put on the ring. Just that, and all would become clear to him. Once more the slowness and mud would leave his thoughts, all possibilities and futures transparent to him. He would see through the shadow's plans and devise an irresistible counterstroke. And he would never be able to take off the ring, not again, not by any will that would be left to him. All Frodo had of those moments were fading memories, but he knew that it had felt like dying, to let all his towers of thought collapse and become only Frodo once more. It had felt like dying. He remembered that much of Weathertop, even if he remembered little else. And if he did wear the ring again, it would be better to die with it on his finger, to end his life while he was still himself. For Frodo knew that he could not withstand the effects of wearing the ring a second time, not afterward, when the limitless clarity was lost to him. Frodo looked around the council, at the poor lost leaderless wise, and he knew they could not defeat the shadow by their own strength. "I will wear it one last time," Frodo said, his voice broken and failing, as he had known from the beginning that he would say in the end. "One last time to find the answer for this council, and then there will be other hobbits." "No!" screamed the voice of Sam, as the other hobbit began to rush forward from where he had hidden. Even as Frodo, with movement as swift and precise as a Nazgul, took out the ring from beneath his shirt. And somehow Bilbo was already standing there, and had already thrust his finger through. It all happened before even Gandalf's staff could point, before Aragorn could level the hilt shard of his sword. The dwarves shouted in shock, and the elves were dismayed. "Of course," said Bilbo's voice, as Frodo began to weep. "I see it now. I understand everything at last. Listen, listen, and swiftly. Here is what you must do." The witch and the wardrobe with a critical eye. Peter looked over the encamped centaurs with their bows, beavers with their long daggers, and talking bears with their chainmail draped over them. He was in charge, because he was one of the mythical sons of Adam and had declared himself High King of Narnia. But the truth was he didn't really know much about encampments, weapons, and guard patrols. In the end, all he could see was that they all looked proud and confident, and Peter had to hope they were right about that, because if you couldn't believe in your own people, you couldn't believe in anyone. "They'd scare me if I had to fight 'em," Peter said finally, "but I don't know if it's enough to beat." "Huh. You don't suppose this mysterious lion will actually show up and help us, do you?" said Lucy. Her voice was very quiet, so that none of the creatures around them would hear. "Only it'd be nice to really have him, don't you think, instead of just letting people think that he put us in charge?" Susan shook her head, shaking the magical arrows in the quiver on her back. "If there was really someone like that," Susan said, "he wouldn't have let the White Witch cover the land in winter for 100 years, would he?" "I had the strangest dream," Lucy said, her voice even quieter, "where we didn't have to organize any creatures or convince them to fight. We just walked into this place, and the lion was already here, with all the armies already mustered, and he went and rescued Edmund, and then we rode alongside him into this tremendous battle where he killed the White Witch." "Did the dream have a moral?" said Peter. "I don't know," said Lucy, blinking and looking a little puzzled. "In the dream it all seemed pointless somehow." "I think maybe the land of Narnia was trying to tell you," said Susan, "or maybe it was just your own dreams trying to tell you that if there was really such a person as that lion, there'd be no use for us. My Little Pony, Friendship is Science, Applejack, who told me outright that I was mistaken, represents the spirit of honesty." Twilight Sparkle raised her head even higher, mane blowing like a wind about the dusky sky of her neck. Fluttershy, who approached the manticore to find out about the thorn in its paw, represents the spirit of investigation. Pinkie Pie, who realized that the awful faces were just trees, represents the spirit of formulating alternative hypotheses. Rarity, who solved the serpent's problem, represents the spirit of creativity. Rainbow Dash, who saw through the false offer of her heart's desire, represents the spirit of analysis. Marie Susan, who made us convince her that we were right before she agreed to come on our expedition, represents the spirit of peer review. And when those elements are ignited by the spark of curiosity that resides in the heart of all of us, it creates the seventh element, the element of psi. The blast of power that came forth was like a wind of moonless night. It caught Marie Susan before the pony could even flinch, and she was gone without a trace before any of them had the chance to rear in shock. From the dark thing that stood in the center of the dais, where the elements had shattered, from the scarce recognizable void-black outline of a horse, came a voice that seemed to bypass all ears and burn like cold fire, sounding directly in the brain of everybody who heard. Did you expect me to just stand there and let you finish? Twilight Sparkle stared at the space where Marie Susan had been, where not a trace of the unicorn remained. She in the back of her mind, unheard, she was aware that Rarity was screaming. That wasn't a disintegration, said the voice of Nightmare. I sent her somewhere else. Rarity's scream stopped abruptly. Twilight Sparkle felt like her own scream was only beginning. 7. It took 7 ponies to use the elements of inquiry. Everyone knew that no matter how honest, investigating, skeptical, creative, analytic, or curious you were, what really made your work science was when you published your results in a prestigious journal. Everyone knew that. Could there be more than one element of peer review at a time? How long would it take to find another one? And the Nightmare wouldn't just stand there and let them do it. Where? Yelled Rainbow Dash. Where'd you put her? I put the little pony in the same place I bound my pathetic sister, in the heart of her pathetic son. She'll die, cried Fluttershy, staring at the Nightmare in horror. It's too hot, she'll burn. Oh, don't worry. The power of the Nightmare surrounds your little friend, keeping her safe and cool, sustaining her without food or drink. She will suffer nothing more than boredom. The void-black outline stepped off the dais, walking slowly, deliberately, past the remaining 6 ponies. So long as the Nightmare's power is not broken by any backup plans my sister may have set in motion, for example, and which may be known to you. In that case, she will vaporize instantly. Such a lovely thing, friendship. It makes such a wonderful instrument of blackmail. Be sure to keep safe the elements of inquiry. You wouldn't want anyone else using them on me now, would you? No, whispered Twilight Sparkle as the horror began to dawn on her. Then a crawling sensation all over her skin as the Nightmare walked past her, and the deadly power brushed her with its cold caress. Now, if you'll pardon me, my little ponies, I have an eternal night to rule over. The village hidden in the clarity. Consider the computational power required to manifest over 100 shadow clones, the Uchiha genius said in his dispassionate tones. It is an error of rationality, Sakura, to say fluke and think you have explained anything. Fluke is simply the name one gives to data that one is ignoring. But it has to be a fluke, Sakura yelled. With effort, she calmed her voice into the careful precision expected of a rationality ninja. It wouldn't do to have her crush think she was stupid. Like you said, the computational power required to use over 100 cage bunshin is simply absurd. We're talking the level of a major superintelligence. Naruto's the dead last of our class. He's not even Jounin level smart, let alone a superintelligence. The Uchiha's eyes gleamed, almost as though he had activated his smartingen. Naruto can manifest 100 independently acting clones. He must have the raw brain power. But under ordinary circumstances, something prevents him from using this computational power efficiently. Like a mind at war within itself, perhaps. We now have cause to believe that Naruto is in some way connected to a superintelligence, and as a recently graduated genin, he, like us, is 15 years old. What happened 15 years ago, Sakura? It took a moment for Sakura to comprehend, to remember, and then she understood. The attack of the Nine Brains demon fox, just a small bone-white creature with big ears and bigger tail and beady red eyes. It was no stronger than an ordinary fox. It didn't breathe fire or flash laser eyes. It possessed no chakra and no magic of any kind. But its intelligence was over 9,000 times that of a human being. Hundreds had been killed, half the buildings wrecked. Almost the whole village of Basugakyo had been destroyed. You think the Kyuubi is hiding inside Naruto, Sakura said. A moment later, her brain automatically went on to fill in the obvious implications of the theory. The software conflict between their existences is why he acts like a gibbering idiot half the time, but can control 100 cage bunshin. That makes a lot of sense, actually. Sasuke gave her the brief, contemptuous nod of someone who had figured all this out on his own, without anyone else needing to prompt him. No. said Sakura. Only years of sanity exercises channeled her complete screaming panic into pragmatically useful policy options. Shouldn't we tell someone about this, like sometime in the next 5 seconds? The adults already know, Sasuke said emotionlessly. It is the obvious explanation for their treatment of Naruto. No, the real question is how this fits into the outwitting of the Uchiha. I don't see how it fits at all, began Sakura. It must fit. A tinge of frantic emotion flickered in Sasuke's voice. I asked that man why he did it, and he told me that when I knew the answer to that, it would explain everything. Surely this must also be part of what is to be explained. Sakura sighed to herself. Her personal hypothesis was that Itachi had just been trying to drive his brother into clinical paranoia. Yo, kids, said the voice of their Rationality sensei from their radio earpieces. There's a village in Wave trying to build a bridge, and it keeps falling down for no reason anyone can figure out. Meet up at the gates at noon. It's time for your first C-ranked analysis mission. This has now inspired an extended fanfiction, Lighting Up the Dark by Velorian. Erdo's in chains. How could you do it, Anita? Said Richard, his voice very tight. How could you co-author a paper with Jean-Claude? You study the undead, you don't collaborate with them on papers. And what about you? I spat. You co-authored a paper with Sylvie. It's all right for you to be prolific, but not me. I'm the head of her institute, Richard growled. Could feel the waves of science radiating off him. He was angry. I have to work with Sylvie. It doesn't mean anything. I thought our own research was special, Anita. It is, I said, feeling helpless about my inability to explain things to Richard. He didn't understand the thrill of being a polymath, the new worlds that were opening up to me. I didn't share our research with anyone, but you wanted to, said Richard. I didn't say anything, but I knew that the look on my face said it all. God, Anita, you've changed, said Richard. He seemed to slump in on himself. Do you realize that the monsters are joking about Blake numbers now? I used to be your partner in everything, and now I'm just another werewolf with a Blake number of 1. Thunder smarts, I am sick of this, shouted Lionel. Sick of doing this every single week. Our species was capable of interstellar travel, Panthro. I know the quantities of energy involved. There is no way you can't build a nuke or steer an asteroid, or somehow blow up that ever-living idiot's pyramid. He-Man and the masters of rationality, fabulous secret knowledge, was revealed to me on the day I held aloft my magic book and said, by the power of Bayes' theorem, fate say night I am the core of my thoughts belief, is my body and choice, is my blood I have revised over 1,000 judgments unafraid of loss, nor aware of gain, have withstood pain to update many times waiting for truth's arrival. This is the one uncertain path. My whole life has been unlimited Bayes works. The name of the Rationality, the 11-year-old boy who would someday become legend's slayer of dragons, killer of kings, had but one thought upon his mind as he approached the sorting hat to enter into the study of mysteries. Anywhere but Ravenclaw, anywhere but Ravenclaw, oh please, anywhere but Ravenclaw. But no sooner the brim of the ancient felted device slipped over his forehead, Ravenclaw. As the table decked in blue began to applaud him as he approached the dread table where he would spend the next 7 years, Kvarth was already wincing inside, waiting for the inevitable. And the inevitable happened almost at once, exactly as he had feared it, before he'd even had a chance to sit down properly. So, an older boy said with a happy expression of someone who's thought of something terribly clever, Kvarth the Raven, huh? Tenjin Topper Rationality, 40K. I have a truly marvelous story for this crossover which this margin is too narrow to contain. Utilitarian Twilight, note, written after I heard Alicorn was writing a Twilight fanfic, but before I read Luminosity. It's obvious if you're one of us. Edward, said Isabella tenderly. She reached up a hand and stroked his cold, sparkling cheek. You don't have to protect me from anything. I've listed out all the upsides and all the downsides, assigned them consistent relative weights, and it's just really obvious that the benefits of becoming a vampire outweigh the drawbacks. Bella, Edward said, and swallowed desperately. Bella, immortality, perfect health, awakening psychic powers. Easy enough to survive on animal blood once you do it. Even the beauty, Edward, there are people who would give their lives to be pretty, and don't you dare call them shallow until you've tried being ugly. Do you think I'm scared of the word vampire? I'm tired of your arbitrary deontological constraints, Edward. The whole human species ought to be in on your fun, and people are dying by the thousands, even as you hesitate. The gun in his lover's hand was cold against his forehead. It wouldn't kill him, but it would disable him for long enough, Jasmine, and the lamp Aladdin's face was wistful, but determined, as the newly minted street urchin addressed the blue being of cosmic power for one last time, prepared to leave behind the wealth and hope he had so briefly tasted for the sake of his friend. Genie, I make my third wish. I wish for you to be Princess Jasmine, who had been staring at this with her mouth open, not quite believing what she was seeing, just barely managed to overcome her paralysis and yank the lamp out of the boy's hand before he could finish the fatal sentence. Excuse me, said Jasmine. Aladdin, my darling, you're cute, but you're an idiot. Do you know that? Did you not notice how once Jaffa got his hands on this lamp, he got his own 3 wishes? Oh, never mind. Genie, I wish for everyone to always be young and healthy. I wish nobody ever had to die if they didn't want to. And I wish for everyone's intelligence to gradually increase at a rate of 1 point per year. She tossed the lamp back to Aladdin. Go back to what you were doing. Rationalist Hamlet, contributed by Histocrat on LiveJournal, post 13,389, aka ArnordDB on Less Wrong. Reposted with permission, Hamlet Interloper. Abandon this strange prank, which makes cruel use of the blindness of my grief, and the good heart of my good friend Horatio. Or else, if thou hast true title to this beloved form, tell me, what drawing did I present to Hamlet King when 6 years old and scarce out of my sling? Ghost, 'twas a unicorn clad all in mail. Hamlet what? Ghost mark me. Hamlet father I will. Ghost my hour is almost come, when I to sulphurous and tormenting flames must render up myself. Hamlet thou art in torment. Ghost I, as are all who die unshriven. Hamlet, like every Dane, this is what I've been taught. Yet I did figure such caprice ill-suited to Almighty God. For all who suffer unlooked for deaths, unattended by God's chosen priests, to be then punished for the ill-ordering of the world. Ghost, 'twas not the world that killed me, nor accident of any kind. Hamlet what? Ghost, if thou didst ever thy dear father love, revenge his foul and most unnatural murder. Hamlet, O God! Ghost, my time grows ever shorter. Wilt thou hear the tale? Hamlet, no. Ghost what? Hamlet, my love for you does call me to avenge your death, but greater crimes have I heard told this night. If all those murdered go to hell, and others as well, who would have confessed had they the time, if people who are in balance, good, suffer grisly at the hands of God, then I defy God's plan. Good ghost, as one who dwells beyond the veil, you know things that we mortals scarce conceive. Tell me, is there some filter or device, outside nature's ken, but not outside her means, by which death itself may be escaped? Ghost, you seek to evade hell. Hamlet, I seek to deny hell to everyone. And heaven too, for I suspect the heaven of our mad God might be a paltry thing, next to the heaven I will make of earth, when I am its immortal king. Ghost, I care not for these things. Death and hell have stripped away all of my desires, save for revenge upon my murderer. Hamlet, thou shalt not be avenged, save that thou swear. And I slay thine killer, so wilt thou vouchsafe to me the means by which I might slay death. He who killed you will join you in the pit, and then that's it. No further swelling of hell's ranks will I permit. Ghost done. When my brother is slain, he who poured the poison in my ear, then will I pour in yours the precious truth, the making of the philosopher's stone. With this stone thou mayst procure a filter to render any man immune to death, and more transmute base metal to gold, to fund the provision of this filter to all mankind. Hamlet, truly there is nothing beyond the dreaming of philosophy. Wait, the man whom I must kill, my uncle the king. Ghost I, that incestuous, that adulterate beast, with witchcraft of his wit, with traitorous gifts Hamlet indeed, he has such gifts I near despair, of killing him and yet succeeding to his throne. 'Twill be an awesome fight for awesome stakes. Hast thou advice? A cock crows. Exit Ghost. ArnordDB has now extended this to a complete ebook, entitled A Will Most Incorrect to Heaven, The Tragedy of Prince Hamlet and the Philosopher's Stone, available for $3 at makeful.com. Yes, really, Moby Dick, and the methods of rationality, as related by Ennis on Less Wrong. Revenge, said the peg-legged man. On a whale. No, I decided I'd just get on with my life. Alice in the Land Where Things Are Even Crazier Than Here, as first written by Braindle in a review of this chapter, with some further edits. Alice was sitting by her sister on the bank, reading a book. She had several friends who were older, and if she just asked nicely, they were often happy to lend her books without quite so many pictures and conversations as was thought appropriate for a girl her age. Hot days often made her feel sleepy and stupid, so Alice had thoughtfully wet a handkerchief and placed it at the back of her neck. Still her mind had gone off wandering, just as if it was some little kitten whose owner had taken off her eyes for just a moment. And she had just decided that the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be worth around 4/3 of the trouble of getting up and picking the daisies, which was nonetheless not equal to the opportunity cost of putting down her book, when suddenly a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by her. There was nothing so very remarkable in that, nor, in fact, did Alice think it so very much out of the way to hear the rabbit say to itself, oh dear, I shall be late." But when the rabbit actually took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket and looked at it, and then hurried on, Alice froze in sudden clarity and fear, for she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat pocket or a watch to take out of it. "Oh, bother," she said to herself, though not aloud. She had long since cured herself of that habit, as it made people take her even less seriously than they already did. If I did not immediately recognize how much curiouser that was than the average rabbit, then something is interfering with my curiosity, and that is most curious of all. So, burning with questions, she ran across the field after it, and was just in time to see it pop down a large rabbit hole under the hedge. Welcome to the real world. Thanks to D. Summerstay for reminding me to post this one, Morpheus. For the longest time, I wouldn't believe it. But then I saw the fields with my own eyes, watched them liquefy the dead so they could be fed intravenously to the living. Neo, politely. Excuse me, please. Morpheus. Yes, Neo. Neo. I've kept quiet for as long as I could, but I feel a certain need to speak up at this point. The human body is the most inefficient source of energy you could possibly imagine. The efficiency of a power plant at converting thermal energy into electricity decreases as you run the turbines at lower temperatures. If you had any sort of food humans could eat, it would be more efficient to burn it in a furnace than feed it to humans. And now you're telling me that their food is the bodies of the dead, fed to the living. Haven't you ever heard of the laws of thermodynamics? Morpheus, where did you hear about the laws of thermodynamics, Neo? Neo, anyone who's made it past one science class in high school ought to know about the laws of thermodynamics. Morpheus, where did you go to high school, Neo? Pause. Neo, in the Matrix. Morpheus, the machines tell elegant lies. Pause. Neo, in a small voice. Could I please have a real physics textbook? Morpheus, there is no such thing, Neo. The universe doesn't run on math. 65. Contagious lies. Hermione Granger had read somewhere once that one of the keys to staying thin was to pay attention to the food you ate, to notice yourself eating it, so that you were satisfied with the meal. This morning she'd made herself toast and put butter on the toast and cinnamon on the butter, and it really should have been enough to get her to notice, this time, the goodness that was in front of her. Without noticing the cinnamon or the butter, without noticing the food or that she was eating, Hermione swallowed another bite of toast and said, "Can you try explaining that again? I'm still completely flabbergasted." "It's pretty straightforward if you think like a light-side Slytherin," said the boy that everyone else in school, excepting only the two of them, now believed to be her true love. Harry Potter's spoon absent-mindedly stirred his breakfast cereal. He hadn't taken many bites of it this morning, not that Hermione had seen. Every good thing in the world brings its own opposition into existence. Phoenixes are no exception. Hermione took another unnoticed bite out of her buttered and cinnamon toast and said, "How can anyone not understand that Fawkes thinks you're a good enough person to ride around on your shoulder? He wouldn't do that with a dark wizard. He just wouldn't." And she hadn't yelled at anyone about Fawkes's touch on her own cheek because she knew it wouldn't be right, that if a phoenix touched you, you weren't supposed to brag about it. That wasn't what a phoenix was for. But she'd really hoped that it would squash the rumors about Harry Potter going evil and Hermione Granger following him down. And it hadn't. And she truly couldn't understand why not. Harry ate another bite of his cereal, his eyes going distant now, no longer meeting her own. Think of it this way. You skip school one day, and you lie and tell your teacher you were sick. The teacher tells you to bring a doctor's note, so you forge one. The teacher says she's going to call the doctor to check, so you have to give her a fake number for the doctor, and get a friend to pretend to be the doctor when she calls. You did what? Harry looked up from his cereal then, and now he was smiling. I'm not saying I really did that, Hermione. Then his eyes abruptly dropped back down to his cereal. No, just an example. Lies propagate, that's what I'm saying. You've got to tell more lies to cover them up, lie about every fact that's connected to the first lie. And if you kept on lying, and you kept on trying to cover it up, sooner or later, you'd even have to start lying about the general laws of thought. Like someone is selling you some kind of alternative medicine that doesn't work, and any double-blind experimental study will confirm that it doesn't work. So if someone wants to go on defending the lie, they've got to get you to disbelieve in the experimental method. Like, the experimental method is just for merely scientific kinds of medicine, not amazing alternative medicine like theirs. Or a good and virtuous person should believe as strongly as they can, no matter what the evidence says. Or truth doesn't exist, and there's no such thing as objective reality. A lot of common wisdom like that isn't just mistaken, it's anti-epistemology, it's systematically wrong. Every rule of rationality that tells you how to find the truth, there's someone out there who needs you to believe the opposite. If you once tell a lie, the truth is ever after your enemy. And there's a lot of people out there telling lies. Harry's voice stopped. What does that have to do with Fawkes? She said. Harry withdrew his spoon from his cereal and pointed in the direction of the head table. The headmaster has a phoenix, right? And he's chief warlock of the Wisengamot, so he's got political opponents like Lucius. Now, do you think that opposition is going to just roll over and surrender because Dumbledore has a phoenix and they don't? Do you think they'll admit that Fawkes is even evidence that Dumbledore's a good person? Of course not. They've got to invent something to say that makes Fawkes not important. Like, phoenixes only follow people who charge straight at anyone they think is evil. So having a phoenix just means you're an idiot or a dangerous fanatic. Or phoenixes just follow people who are pure Gryffindor, so Gryffindor, they don't have the virtues of other houses. Or it just shows how much courage a magical animal thinks you have, nothing else, and it wouldn't be fair to judge politicians based on that. They have to say something to deny the phoenix. I bet Lucius didn't even have to make up anything new. I bet it had all been said before, centuries ago, since the first time someone had a phoenix riding on his shoulder, and someone else wanted people not to take that into account as evidence. I bet by the time Fawkes came along, it was already common wisdom. It would have just seemed strange to take into account who a phoenix liked or disliked. It would be like a Muggle newspaper testing political candidates to rate their level of scientific literacy. Every force for good that exists in this universe, there's someone else who benefits from people discounting it or fencing it into a narrow box where it can't get to them. But Hermione said, "Okay, I see why Lucius Malfoy doesn't want anyone to think that Fawkes matters, but why does anyone who isn't a bad guy believe it?" Harry Potter gave a little shrug. His spoon dropped back into his cereal and went on stirring without a pause. Why does any kind of cynicism appeal to people? Because it seems like a mark of maturity, of sophistication, like you've seen everything and know better. Or because putting something down feels like pushing yourself up. Or they don't have a phoenix themselves, so their political instinct tells them there's no advantage to be gained from saying nice things about phoenixes. Or because being cynical feels like knowing a secret truth that common people don't know. Harry Potter looked in the direction of the head table, and his voice dropped until it was almost a whisper. I think maybe that's what he's getting wrong, that he's cynical about everything else, but not about cynicism itself. Without thinking, Hermione looked in the direction of the head table herself, but the defense professor's seat was still empty, as it had been on Monday and Tuesday. The deputy headmistress had pronounced, earlier, that Professor Quirrell's classes for today would be cancelled. Afterward, when Harry had eaten a few bites of treacle tart and then left the table, Hermione looked at Anthony and Padma, who had been coincidentally eating nearby, but certainly not eavesdropping or anything. Anthony and Padma looked back at her. Padma said hesitantly, "Is it just me, or has Harry Potter started talking like a more complicated sort of book in the last few days? I mean, I haven't been listening to him very long, "It's not just you," said Anthony. Hermione didn't say anything, but she was becoming increasingly worried. Whatever had happened to Harry Potter on the day of the Phoenix, it had changed him. There was something new in him now, not cold, but hard. Sometimes she caught him staring out a window at nothing visible, a look of grim determination on his face. In her biology class on Monday, a Venus fire trap had gone out of control, and Harry had tackled Terry out of the way of a fireball, even as Professor Sprout had shouted a flame-freezing charm. And when Harry had risen from the floor, he'd just gone back to his place, like nothing interesting had happened. And when for once she got a better test score than Harry in their transfiguration exam, later that same Monday, Harry had smiled at her as though to congratulate her instead of gritting his teeth, and that had bothered her a lot. She was getting the sense that Harry was pulling away from her. "He seems a lot older all of a sudden," said Anthony. "Not like a real grown-up. I can't imagine Harry as a grown-up, but it's like he suddenly turned into a fourth-year version of whatever he is." "Well," Padma said. She daintily dabbed a chocolate-flavored scone with some scone-flavored frosting. "I think Dragon and Sunshine had better ally during the next battle, or Mr. Harry Potter is going to smash us. We were allied last time, and even then Chaos almost won." "Yeah," said Anthony. "You're right, Miss Pattle. Tell the Dragon General that we want to meet with you." "No," said Hermione. "We shouldn't have to gang up on General Potter just to stand a chance. That doesn't make sense, especially now that nobody can use Muggle things anymore. It's still 24 soldiers in every army." Neither Padma or Anthony said anything to that. "Knock, knock, knock, knock. Come in, Mr. Potter," she said. The door creaked open, and Harry Potter slipped through the opening into her office. He pushed the door shut behind him with one hand and wordlessly seated himself in the cushioned chair that now stood in front of her desk. He transfigured that chair so often that it sometimes changed form to reflect her mood, without any wand movement or incantation or even conscious intent. Right now, that chair had become deeply cushioned, so that as Harry sat down he sank into it, as though the chair were hugging him. Harry didn't seem to notice. There was an air of quiet determination about the boy. His eyes had locked steadily with hers and not let up for a moment. "You called me," said the boy. "I did," said Professor McGonagall. "I have two pieces of good news for you, Mr. Potter. First, have you met Mr. Rubeus Hagrid at all, the groundskeeper? He was an old friend of your parents." Harry hesitated. Then, "Mr. Hagrid spoke to me a bit after I got here," Harry said. "I think it was on Tuesday of my first week of school. He didn't say he knew my parents, though. At the time, I thought he just wanted to introduce himself to the boy who lived. Did he have some kind of hidden agenda?" He didn't seem like the type. "Ah," she said. It took her a moment to pull her thoughts together. "It's a long story, Mr. Potter, but Mr. Hagrid was falsely accused of murdering a student 5 decades ago. Mr. Hagrid's wand was snapped, and he was expelled. Later, when Professor Dumbledore became headmaster, he gave Mr. Hagrid a place here as keeper of grounds and keys." Harry's eyes watched her intently. "You said that 5 decades ago was the last time a student died in Hogwarts, and you were certain that 5 decades ago was the last time someone heard the Sorting Hat's secret message." She felt a slight chill. Even the headmaster or Severus might not have made that connection that quickly, and said, "Yes, Mr. Potter. Someone opened the Chamber of Secrets, but this was not believed, and Mr. Hagrid was blamed for the resulting death. However, the headmaster has located the additional enchantment on the Sorting Hat, and he has shown it to a special panel of the Wisengamot. As a result, Mr. Hagrid's sentence has been revoked, just this morning, in fact, and he will be allowed to acquire a new wand." She hesitated. "We have not yet told Mr. Hagrid of this, Mr. Potter. We were waiting until the deed was done, so as not to give him false hope after so long, Mr. Potter. We were wondering if we could tell Mr. Hagrid that it was you who helped him." She saw the weighing look in his eyes. "I remember Mr. Hagrid holding you when you were a baby," she said. "I think he would be very happy to know." She could see it, though, on Harry's face, the moment when he decided that Rubeus wouldn't be any use to him. Harry shook his head. "Bad enough that someone might deduce there was a Parselmouth in this year's crop of students," Harry said. "I think it'd be more prudent to just keep it all as secret as possible." She remembered James and Lily, who never hesitated to return the friendship the huge, bluff man had offered them, for all that James was the scion of a wealthy house or Lily a budding charms mistress. and Rubius a mere half-giant whose wand had been snapped. Because you don't expect him to prove useful, Mr. Potter. There was silence. She hadn't intended to say that out loud. Sadness crossed Harry's face. Probably, Harry said quietly, but I don't think he and I would get along, do you? Something seemed to be stuck in her throat. Speaking of making use of people, Harry said, it seems I'm going to be thrown into a war with a Dark Lord sometime soon. So while I'm in your office, I'd like to ask that my sleep cycle be extended to 30 hours per day. Neville Longbottom wants to start practicing dueling. There's an older Hufflepuff who offered to teach him, and they invited me to join. Plus, there's other things I want to learn too. And if you or the headmaster think I should study anything in particular in order to become a powerful wizard when I grow up, let me know. Please direct Madame Pomfrey to administer the appropriate potion, or whatever it is that she needs to do, Mr. Potter. Harry's eyes gazed directly into her own. Yes, Minerva. I know it wasn't your idea, but I'd like to survive the use the headmaster's making of me. Please don't be an obstacle to that. It almost broke her. Harry, she whispered in a bare voice, children shouldn't have to think like that. You're right, they shouldn't, Harry said. A lot of children have to grow up too early, though, not just me. And most children like that would probably trade places with me in 5 seconds. I'm not going to pity myself, Professor McGonagall, not when there are people out there in real trouble, and I'm not one of them. She swallowed hard and said, Mr. Potter, at 30 hours per day, you'll get older, you'll age faster, like Albus. And in my 5th year, I'll be around the same physiological age as Hermione, said Harry. Doesn't seem that terrible. There was a wry smile now on Harry's face. Honestly, I'd probably want this even if there weren't a Dark Lord. Wizards live for a while, and either wizards or muggles will probably push that out even further over the next century. There's no reason not to pack as many hours into a day as I can. I've got things I plan to do, and 'twere well they were done quickly. There was a long pause. All right, Minerva said. It came out as almost a whisper. She raised her voice. All right, Mr. Potter, I shall ask the headmaster, and if he agrees, it shall be done. Harry's eyes narrowed for a moment. I see. Then please remind the headmaster that Godric Gryffindor, in his last words, said that if it had been the right thing for him to do, then he wouldn't tell anyone else to choose wrongly, not even the youngest student in Hogwarts. And she knew with a hollow feeling that any chance of Albus stopping any of this, had just vanished into nothingness. That was what Albus had told her when she'd objected that Cameron Edward was too young, and then when she'd objected that Peter Pevensey was too young, and finally she'd given up objecting. Who told you that, Mr. Potter? Not Albus. Surely Albus would never say that to any student. I've been doing a lot of reading lately, Harry said. His body started to rise from the enveloping chair, then halted. Dare I ask about the second piece of good news? Oh, she said. Professor Quirrell has woken up and says that you may. The Hogwarts infirmary was a brilliantly open space, skylit on all 4 sides despite seeming to be located squarely in the middle of the castle. White beds in long rows stretched out, only 3 of them occupied at the moment. One older boy and one older girl on opposite sides, both lying motionless with their eyes closed, probably unconscious and spellbound, while some healing charm or potion reconfigured their bodies in uncomfortable ways. And the third occupant had the curtain drawn around their bed, which was presumably a good thing. Madame Pomfrey had pushed him along with a hard shove and told him not to gawk, and Harry had needed to remind himself sharply that some people still didn't know who the boy who lived was, either that, or Madame Pomfrey's identity was bound up with her absolute dominance of her own hospital, etc., whatever. Behind the rows of beds were 5 doors, leading into the private rooms where they stored the patients who would be staying for days instead of hours, but whose condition didn't warrant a transfer to St. Mungo's, windowless, skyless, unlit, but for a single smokeless torch on one of the solid stone walls. That was the room behind the middle door. Harry had wondered whether professors could ask Hogwarts to change itself, or if the infirmary always had a room like that available for people who didn't enjoy the light. In the center of the room, between 2 equal bedstands that looked to have been carved from the same grey marble as the walls, rested a white hospital bed, looking vaguely orangish in the unsmoking torchlight. And within that bed, A white sheet pulled up about his thighs, and wearing a hospital gown, sat Professor Quirrell with his back slightly propped up against the headboard of the bed. There was something frightening about seeing Professor Quirrell in one of Madame Pomfrey's beds, even if the defense professor appeared uninjured. Even knowing that Professor Quirrell had deliberately arranged his own apparent defeat at Severus's hands to give himself an excuse to recover his strength from Azkaban. Harry had never actually watched anyone dying in a hospital bed, but he'd seen too many movies. It was an intimation of mortality, and the defense professor was not supposed to be mortal. Madame Pomfrey had told Harry that he was absolutely forbidden to pester her patient. Harry had said, "I understand," which technically did not say anything about obedience. The stern old healer had then turned and started to say to Professor Quirrell that he was absolutely not to overexert himself or upset himself. Madame Pomfrey had trailed off, hurriedly turned around, and fled the room. "Not bad," Harry observed, after the door had shut behind the escaping medical matron. "I've got to learn how to do that sometime." Professor Quirrell smiled a smile with absolutely no humor content and said, his voice sounding a good deal drier than its usual dryness, "Thank you for your artistic critique, Mr. Potter." Harry stared into the pale blue eyes and thought that Professor Quirrell looked older. It was subtle. It might have just been Harry's imagination. It might have been the poor lighting. But the hair above Quirinus Quirrell's forehead might have receded a bit. What remained might have thinned and grayed, an advancing of the baldness that had already been visible on the back of his head. The face might have grown a little sunken. The pale blue eyes had stayed sharp and intense. "I am glad," Harry said quietly, "to see you in what appears to be good health." "Appearances can be deceiving, of course," said Professor Quirrell. He gave a flick of his fingers, and when his hand finished the gesture, he was holding his wand. "Would you believe that woman thinks she has confiscated this from me?" 6 incantations, the defense professor spoke then, 6 of the 30 that he had used to safeguard their important conversations in Mary's room. Harry raised his eyebrows, silently quizzical. "That is all I can manage for now," said the defense professor. "I expect it shall prove sufficient." Still, there is a proverb: if you do not wish a thing heard, do not say it. Consider it to apply in full measure. I am told that you were trying to see me. "Yes," Harry said. He paused, gathered his thoughts. "Did the headmaster or anyone tell you that we can't go to lunch anymore?" "Something along those lines," said the defense professor, and without changing expression, "Of course I was terribly sorry to hear it." "It's more extreme than that, actually," said Harry. "I'm confined to Hogwarts and its grounds indefinitely. I can't leave without a guard and a good reason. I'm not going home for summer, and maybe not ever again. I was hoping to speak with you about that." There was a pause. The defense professor exhaled a breath like a brief sigh and said, "We shall just have to rely on the known fact that the deputy headmistress will personally murder anyone who tries to report me. Mr. Potter, I intend to keep this conversation on track so that we may conclude it quickly. Is that understood?" Harry nodded, and in the light of the single torch, shaded toward the reddish end of the optical spectrum, the snake's green scales were not very reflective, and the blue and white banding hardly more so. Dark seemed the snake in that light. The eyes, which had seemed like gray pits before, now reflected the torchlight and seemed brighter than the rest of the snake. "SSO," hissed the venomous creature. "What did you wish to say?" And Harry hissed, "Schoolmaster thinks that woman's former lord is the one who stole her from prison." Harry had thought about it this time, and carefully, before he had decided that he would reveal to Professor Quirrell only that the headmaster believed that, and not say anything about the prophecy which had set Voldemort on Harry's parents, nor that the headmaster was reconstituting the Order of the Phoenix. It was a risk, a significant risk, but Harry needed an ally in this. "He believeth that one is alive," the snake finally said. The divided, two-pronged tongue flickered rapidly from side to side, sardonic, snackish laughter. Somehow I am not suppressed." "Yes," Harry hissed dryly, "very amusing, I am sure. Except now I'm stuck in Hogwarts for next 6 years for Safety. I have decided that I will indeed seek power, and confinement is not helpful for that. Must convince schoolmaster that Dark Lord is not yet awakened, that escape was work of some other power." Again the rapid flickering of the snake's tongue. The snackish laughter was stronger, drier this time. Amateur foolishness. Pardon, hissed Harry. USC mistake. Think of undoing S setting time back to S start. Yet not even with hourglass can time be undone. Must move forward instead. You think of convincing others they are mistaken. Far easier to convince them they are right. SSO consider, boy. What new happenstance would make schoolmaster decide you were S-safe once more, S-simultaneously advance your other agendas? Harry stared at the snake, puzzled. His mind tried to comprehend and unravel the riddle. Is it not obvious? Hissed the snake. Again the tongue flickered sardonic laughter. To free yourself, to gain power in Britain, you must again be S-seen to defeat the Dark Lord. In reddish-orange flickering torchlight, a green snake swayed above a white hospital bed as the boy stared into the embers of its eyes. SSO, Harry said finally. Let us be clear on what is proposed. You suggest that we set up impostor to impersonate Dark Lord. Something like that. Woman we rescued will cooperate. Should be most convincing when she is seen at his side. More sardonic tongue flickering. You are kidnapped from Hogwarts to public location. Many witnesses, wards keep out protectors. Dark Lord announces that he has at long last regained physical form after wandering as S-spirit for years. S says that he has gained S still greater power. Not even you can S-stop him now. Offers to let you duel. You cast Guardian Charm. Dark Lord laughs at you. S says he is not Life Eater. Casts Killing Curse at you. You block. Watchers see Dark Lord explode. Cast Killing Curse. Harry hissed in incredulity. At me, again, second time. Nobody will believe Dark Lord could possibly be that stupid. You and I are only two people in country who would notice that, hissed the snake. Trust me on this boy. What if there is third someday? The snake swayed thoughtfully. Could write different script for play if you wish. Whatever scenario, should leave open possibility Dark Lord might return yet again. Nation must think they are still dependent on you to protect them. Harry stared into the red flickering pits of the snake's eyes. Well, hissed the swaying form. The obvious thought was that going along with the defense professor's plots and deceptions a second time, spinning an even more complicated lie to cover up the first mistake, and creating another fatal vulnerability if anyone ever discovered the truth, would be exactly the same sort of stupidity as the putative Dark Lord using the killing curse again. It didn't even take his Hufflepuff side to point that out. Harry thought it in his very own mental voice. But there was also a certain question as to whether the appropriate moral to learn from the last experience was to always say no immediately to the defense professor, or, we'll think about it, hissed Harry. We'll not answer right away this time. We'll enumerate risks and benefits first. Understood, hissed the snake. But remember this, boy, other events proceed without you. Hesitation is always easy, rarely useful. The boy emerged from the private room into the main infirmary, running nervous fingers through his messy black hair as he walked past the white beds, occupied and unoccupied. Shortly afterward, the boy emerged from the Hogwarts infirmary entirely, passing Madame Pomfrey on the way out with a distracted nod. The boy walked out into a hallway, then into a larger corridor, and then stopped and leaned against the wall. The thing was, he really didn't want to be stuck in Hogwarts for the next 6 years, and when you thought about it, the incident with rescuing Bellatrix from Azkaban wasn't just imposing costs on Harry. Other people would be worrying, living in fear of the Dark Lord's return, expending unknown resources to take unknown precautions. Harry could demand that they write the script in such fashion as to make it seem not plausible that the Dark Lord would return a third time. And then people would relax. It would all be over. Unless, of course, there actually was a Dark Lord out there to be feared. There had been a prophecy. The boy leaning against the wall vented a soft sigh and started walking again. Harry had almost forgotten, but he had gotten around to showing Professor Quirrell the deck of cards he'd been given on Sunday night by Santa Claus, within which the King of Hearts was allegedly a portkey that would take him to the Salem Witches Institute in America. Although, of course, Harry hadn't told Professor Quirrell who'd sent him the card, nor what it was supposed to do, before he'd asked Professor Quirrell if it was possible to tell where the portkey would send him. The defense professor had transformed back to human form and examined the King of Hearts, tapping it a few times with his wand. And according to Professor Quirrell, the portkey would send the user somewhere in London, but he couldn't pinpoint it any nearer than that. Harry had shown Professor Quirrell the note that had accompanied the deck of cards, saying nothing of the earlier notes. Professor Quirrell had taken it in at a glance, given a dry chuckle, and observed that if you read the note carefully, it did not explicitly say that the portkey would take him to the Salem Witches' Institute. You needed to learn to pay attention to that kind of subtlety, Professor Quirrell said, if you wanted to be a powerful wizard when you grew up, or, indeed, if you wanted to grow up at all. The boy sighed again as he trudged off to class. He was starting to wonder if all the other wizarding schools were also like this, or if it was only Hogwarts that had a problem.